Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Idling Engine, from Marcus Chen. I've been hauling freight for nearly 20 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of strange thing the highways could throw at me. Ghost lights in the desert, phantom hitchhikers on lonely stretches of interstate, even that peculiar fog that seems to swallow mile markers whole. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered at the Millfield truck stop that cold October night, when the autumn rain drummed steadily against my windshield and the neon signs cast their wavering reflections across puddles of black water. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, pushing the limits of what the logbook would allow, when exhaustion finally forced me to pull into the truck stop just outside of Millfield, Nebraska. The place had the worn, weary look of a business that had seen better decades. The main building squatted beneath flickering fluorescent lights, its windows fogged with condensation, while the fuel pumps stood like sentinels in the misty rain. The parking lot stretched into the darkness beyond, row after row of big rigs lined up like sleeping giants, their chrome bumpers gleaming wetly under the scattered security lights. I found a spot toward the back of the lot, away from the diesel fumes and the constant hum of refrigeration units. The rain had softened to a gentle patter by then, tapping out an irregular rhythm on my cab roof as I settled in for what I hoped would be a few hours of decent sleep. The heater hummed quietly, and I could hear the distant sound of trucks pulling in and out of the fuel lanes, their air brakes hissing like tired sighs in the night. That's when I first noticed the Peterbilt. It sat 3 spaces over from my Kenworth, a classic long-nose model from the late 70s, painted in deep midnight blue with chrome details that caught what little light filtered through the rain. Even in the dim glow of the security lights, I could tell it was beautifully maintained. The paint gleamed as if it had just rolled off a show floor, and every piece of chrome looked polished to perfection. But what struck me most was the sound it was making. The engine was running with that deep, throaty rumble that only comes from a perfectly tuned diesel, the exhaust stacks breathing out steady puffs of vapor that disappeared into the night air. I found myself wondering why the driver would leave such a magnificent machine idling in the lot. Fuel costs alone would make most of us shut down between runs, and the environmental controls at many truck stops required engines to be turned off after a certain period. Yet there it sat, purring like a contented cat, its running lights casting a warm amber glow across the wet pavement. Sleep came in fits and starts that night. Every time I began to drift off, some small sound would pull me back to consciousness. The soft whistle of air leaks, the distant rumble of passing traffic, and always underneath it all the steady thrumming of that Peterbilt's engine. I found myself listening to it, noting how consistent the idle was, how perfectly smooth the rhythm remained. There was something almost hypnotic about it, like a mechanical lullaby that seemed to seep into my bones. Around 3 in the morning I gave up on sleep entirely, and decided to take a walk around the lot. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and humid with the smell of wet asphalt and diesel exhaust. My footsteps echoed softly as I made my way between the rows of trucks, most of them dark and silent, their drivers lost in much-needed rest. But the Peterbilt continued to run, its engine note unchanged, as if it had been idling steadily for hours without missing a beat. As I drew closer, I could see more details in the wash of amber light from the truck's markers. The cab was pristine, with not a scratch or dent visible anywhere on its surface. The chrome bumper bore no road rash, the paint showed no stone chips or weather fade, and even the tires looked as though they'd never touched pavement. It was like looking at a museum piece, perfect and untouched by the harsh realities of over-the-road trucking. But the cab was empty. I stood there in the misty night air, studying the truck from every angle I could manage without actually touching it. The driver's seat sat vacant, positioned as if someone had just climbed down for a quick break. The interior lights were off, leaving the cab dark except for the soft green glow of the instrument panel. I could see gauges flickering in their housings, the tachometer needle holding steady at a perfect idle speed, but no sign of any human presence. The logical part of my mind offered reasonable explanations. Perhaps the driver was in the truck stop restaurant, grabbing a late meal before hitting the road again. Maybe he was in the restroom, or the shower facilities. Some drivers were particular about their equipment, and preferred to keep their engines warm rather than risk a difficult restart in cold weather. But as I stood there listening to that perfectly consistent idle, feeling the subtle vibration of the engine through the ground beneath my feet, those rational explanations began to feel inadequate. I walked a complete circle around the truck, noting details that seemed increasingly impossible. The mud flaps showed no road spray. The license plate was clean enough to read clearly despite what should have been hundreds of miles of wet highway driving. Even the exhaust stacks showed no staining or discoloration that would normally accumulate after years of operation. It was as if the truck existed in some bubble of perpetual newness, untouched by time or wear. When I returned to my own cab, I found myself unable to shake the image of that empty driver's seat. I pulled out my logbook and made a note of the time, then settled back to watch through my side window. The Peterbilt continued to idle, its running lights steady, its exhaust breathing regularly into the night air. I watched for over an hour, fighting to stay awake, but never once did I see anyone approach the truck or climb into the cab. Dawn was still hours away when I made the decision to walk over to the main building and ask about the truck. The restaurant was nearly empty at that hour, just a few drivers nursing coffee and studying their route atlases under the harsh fluorescent lights. The clerk behind the fuel desk was a tired-looking woman in her 50s who barely glanced up from her paperwork when I approached. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice low and casual. "I was wondering about that blue Peterbilt out in the lot, the one that's been idling all night. Do you know if the driver is okay?" She looked up then, her expression shifting from tired indifference to puzzlement. "Blue Peterbilt?" she repeated, setting down her pen. "Honey, I've been here since midnight, and I haven't seen any blue trucks come through. Mostly Freightliners and Volvos tonight, couple of Macs. You sure about the color?" I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "It's parked 3 spaces over from my Kenworth," I said. "Classic long-nose model. Midnight blue paint, chrome everywhere. Been running since I got here around 11. The woman's frown deepened, and she pulled out a clipboard thick with fuel receipts and parking permits. "Let me check the overnight registrations," she murmured, flipping through the pages. After a moment, she shook her head. "No blue Peterbilts on the list. We've got regulations about idling too, honey. Environmental compliance. I would have noticed if someone was running all night without a permit." I thanked her and walked back outside, my mind racing with possibilities that all seemed to lead to increasingly uncomfortable conclusions. The Peterbilt was still there, still running, its engine note as smooth and consistent as it had been hours earlier. But now, in the gray pre-dawn light, I could see something that made my blood run cold. There were no tire tracks leading to or from the truck's parking space. The rain from earlier had left the lot surface soft and muddy, clearly showing the impressions of every vehicle that had moved through the area. I could see my own tracks, meandering paths where other drivers had walked to and from the building, even the clear tread marks of trucks that had departed during the night. But around the Peterbilt's parking space, the mud was smooth and undisturbed, as if the truck had simply materialized there without ever having moved across the ground. I stood frozen in that gray morning light, watching the exhaust vapor rise from the perfectly vertical stacks, listening to the hypnotic rhythm of the engine that had been running all night without a driver. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations, but they all crumbled under the weight of what I was seeing. The truck was there, solid and real, its engine running, its lights glowing, but somehow it existed outside the normal rules that govern the physical world. As I backed slowly toward my own cab, I noticed that the Peterbilt's engine note was beginning to change. The ghost frequency. From Marcus Chen. The thing about being a radar technician for the Department of Transportation is that you see everything that moves on the interstate system, even the things that probably shouldn't be there. My name is Marcus Chen, and for the past 8 years I've been working the graveyard shift at the traffic monitoring station outside Bakersfield, California. The job pays well enough, and the solitude suits me fine. Most nights I sit in my climate-controlled booth surrounded by green glowing screens, watching digital blips crawl across the mapped highways like electronic fireflies. Truckers, late-night commuters, emergency vehicles, they all show up as neat little dots with speed readings and trajectory lines. Clean, predictable, rational. But there are some nights when the rational world develops cracks, and something else bleeds through. It started 3 months ago during a particularly quiet Tuesday in October. The desert air outside was cool and still, with that peculiar emptiness that only comes in the small hours before dawn. I was monitoring a stretch of Interstate 40 that runs through some of the most desolate country in California. Miles and miles of scrubland and distant mountains, with truck stops scattered like oases in an electronic desert. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold hours ago, and I was considering brewing another pot when something unusual appeared on my screen. A convoy of vehicles had materialized on the eastbound lanes, moving at a steady 65 miles per hour. Nothing strange about that, except for the fact that I hadn't seen them enter the monitored zone. Our radar coverage extends for nearly 200 miles in each direction, with overlapping fields that should catch anything larger than a motorcycle. Yet here were 6 distinct signatures. Heavy vehicles by their radar cross-section, traveling in perfect formation, as if they had simply blinked into existence somewhere between mile markers 2047 and 2048. I rubbed my eyes and checked the system diagnostics. Everything appeared normal. The radar dishes were functioning properly, the computer networks were stable, and the backup systems showed no anomalies. I pulled up the traffic camera feeds for that section of highway, cycling through the available views. The road stretched empty under the pale glow of sodium vapor lights, with only the occasional tumblewed drifting across the asphalt. Yet on my radar screen, those 6 vehicles continued their steady eastward progress, maintaining perfect spacing and identical speeds. I called my supervisor, Janet Kowalski, knowing she was probably asleep but feeling obligated to report the anomaly. Her voice was thick with sleep when she answered, but she listened patiently as I described what I was seeing. She suggested a glitch in the radar processing software, maybe some kind of ghost echo from earlier traffic. Log it in the incident report, she told me, and keep monitoring. If they're real trucks, they'll show up on the cameras eventually. But they never did. For the next 47 minutes, I watched those 6 radar signatures travel across my screen, while the traffic cameras showed nothing but empty highway. The vehicles maintained their formation with mechanical precision, never varying their speed, never changing lanes, never stopping. When they finally reached the eastern edge of my monitoring zone, they simply disappeared, not gradually fading as vehicles normally do when they move beyond radar range, but vanishing all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. I documented everything in my report, including timestamps, coordinates, and screen captures of the radar data. Janet reviewed it the next day and suggested we have the technicians check the equipment, but they found nothing wrong. The incident joined the growing file of unexplained phenomena that every monitoring station accumulates over the years. Weird weather patterns, equipment malfunctions, and the occasional unidentified flying object that turns out to be a weather balloon or military drone. 3 weeks passed before I saw them again. This time they appeared on a foggy November night, when the desert was wrapped in an unseasonable marine layer that had drifted in from the coast. The convoy materialized in the same location, traveling at the same speed in the same formation. 6 vehicles, perfectly spaced, moving with the relentless consistency of a clock mechanism. Once again, the traffic cameras showed nothing but fog-shrouded highway, while my radar painted those unmistakable signatures crawling across the green-tinted screen. I didn't call Janet this time. Instead, I tried something different. Using the radio communication system, I broadcast on Channel 19, the frequency most truckers monitor. "This is DOT monitoring station Baker 7, I said, my voice echoing strangely in the quiet control room. "I show a 6-vehicle convoy eastbound on I-40 near mile marker 250. Please respond if you copy." The radio crackled with static, then a voice emerged from the white noise, distant and hollow, like someone speaking through a long tunnel. "Copy that, Baker 7. This is Phantom Leader. Convoy proceeding as scheduled. No assistance required." My blood seemed to chill in my veins. Phantom Leader. The voice had an unusual quality, not quite natural, as if it were being filtered through some kind of electronic processing system. But more disturbing was the complete lack of background noise, no engine sounds, no road noise, no CB chatter from other drivers, just that hollow echoing voice speaking into perfect silence. "Phantom Leader, this is Baker 7, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't have you on visual. Can you confirm your vehicle type and cargo?" Static filled the channel for a long moment. Then the voice returned, fainter now but unmistakably present. "Cargo is classified, Baker 7. Suggest you discontinue monitoring. Some loads are better left unseen." The radio fell silent, and slowly, inevitably, the convoy reached the edge of my radar coverage and vanished once more. But this time, something had changed. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice other anomalies in the area where the convoy appeared. Electronic equipment would malfunction without explanation. Radio communications would be disrupted by bursts of strange interference. And other monitoring stations began reporting similar phenomena. Radar contacts that appeared without explanation, traveling impossible routes through terrain that couldn't support heavy vehicles. I started researching the history of that particular stretch of highway, digging through old DOT records and newspaper archives. What I found made my hands shake as I turned the pages of yellowed newspaper clippings in the Bakersfield Library. In 1987, a convoy of 6 military vehicles had crashed during a desert storm on I-40, near mile marker 12. According to the reports, the vehicles had been transporting classified materials from a Nevada test site to a facility in New Mexico when they were caught in a sudden blizzard, a freak weather event that dumped 18 inches of snow on the desert in a matter of hours. All 6 vehicles had left the roadway and plunged into a deep arroyo. The official report stated that there were no survivors and that the cargo had been secured and relocated by military personnel. But witnesses reported strange phenomena at the crash site for years afterward: unexplained lights, mysterious radio transmissions, and the sound of heavy engines where no roads existed. The reports gradually faded from public attention, but they never completely stopped. I realized with growing certainty that my radar was somehow detecting the ghostly echo of that long-lost convoy, trapped in some kind of electromagnetic loop that replayed their final journey night after night. But knowing the truth didn't make the encounters any less unsettling. If anything, they became more intense, more personal. The voice on the radio began addressing me by name, though I had never identified myself beyond my station designation. "Hello, Marcus," it would say in that hollow, processed tone. "Still watching the roads? Still keeping count of the living and the dead?" The conversations, if they could be called that, became longer and more detailed. Phantom Leader would describe cargo that defied understanding, materials that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, weapons that could wound reality itself, and most disturbing of all, passengers who were neither fully alive nor completely dead. "We've been driving for 36 years, Marcus," the voice told me during one particularly clear transmission. "Always the same route. Always the same destination we never reach. The cargo grows heavier with each passing year, and the passengers grow more restless." I began to understand that the convoy wasn't just trapped in some kind of supernatural loop. It was growing stronger, more solid, more capable of affecting the physical world. Equipment failures increased. Other drivers reported seeing phantom headlights in their mirrors, vehicles that vanished when they tried to get a closer look. And I started to suspect that the convoy was looking for something, or someone, to complete its interrupted journey. The realization hit me 3 nights ago during what should have been a routine shift. The convoy appeared right on schedule, but this time it was different. Instead of maintaining their usual formation, the vehicles began to slow down, converging on a point directly beneath the traffic camera at mile marker. For the first time in months, I could see something on the visual feed, not the trucks themselves, but distortions in the air around them, heat shimmer effects that bent the light from the highway lamps into impossible angles. "We have a problem. One of our passengers is missing." The passenger with no hands. From Jake Morrison. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the pale glow of my headlights. Nothing but darkness on either side, except for the occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse light. I'd been driving this route between Denver and Salt Lake for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture, and I knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every curve in the road. The familiar hum of my Peterbilt's engine was like a lullaby, steady and reassuring as the miles rolled by beneath my 18 wheels. The rain had been coming down in sheets for the better part of an hour, turning the world outside my cab into a watercolor painting of blurred lights and shadows. My wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic rhythm, and the defroster worked overtime to keep the windshield clear. That's when my headlights caught the figure hunched beneath the flickering light of the highway sign. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark coat that hung loose around his frame. His head was down, face hidden beneath the brim of a baseball cap, and he seemed to be struggling with something. As I got closer, I could see him trying to hitch a ride, but something about his movements looked awkward, unnatural. Maybe it was the rain making everything seem strange, or maybe it was the late hour playing tricks on my tired eyes, but I almost drove past him. But 15 years on the road teaches you something about being human, about the small kindnesses that keep the world from going completely cold. I'd picked up hitchhikers before, though not often, and usually only when the weather was bad or when they looked like they really needed help. This man definitely looked like he needed help. The rain drummed against the roof of my cab, and I reached over to unlock the passenger door. The interior light came on as he climbed up into the cab, and that's when I got my first good look at him. He was older than I'd initially thought, maybe in his 60s, with graying hair peeking out from under his cap. His face was weathered and lined, the kind of face you see on men who've spent their lives working outdoors. But what struck me most was how grateful he looked, his pale eyes meeting mine with a mixture of relief and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet and hoarse. "Didn't think anyone would stop in this weather." "No problem," I replied, engaging the clutch and checking my mirrors. "Where are you headed?" "West," he said simply. "Just west." I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't, so I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the interstate. It wasn't unusual for hitchhikers to be vague about their destinations, and I'd learned not to pry too much. Sometimes people were running from something, sometimes toward something, and either way, it usually wasn't my business. The cab fell into a comfortable silence as we drove through the rain-soaked night. My passenger sat quietly, looking out the window at the darkness beyond. I noticed he kept his hands in his coat pockets, which made sense given the cold. The truck's heater was working overtime, filling the cab with warm, dry air that smelled faintly of diesel and the pine air freshener hanging from my mirror. About 20 miles down the road, I offered him some coffee from my thermos. "Help yourself," I said, nodding toward the cup holder beside him. "Should still be warm." He turned to look at me, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Confusion maybe, or embarrassment. "That's kind of you," he said slowly. "But I'm fine." I shrugged and took a sip from my own cup. The coffee was strong and bitter, just the way I liked it on long night runs. Outside, the rain was beginning to let up, though the road was still slick and shiny under my headlights. Radio chatter crackled occasionally from my CB, other drivers checking in about road conditions and traffic ahead. It was around 1:30 in the morning when I started to notice the small things that seemed off. When we'd passed through a construction zone, I'd asked him to hand me the logbook from the glove compartment, and he'd fumbled with the latch for what seemed like an unusually long time. When I glanced over, his movements looked awkward, like he was having trouble gripping the hand. "Arthritis," he said, apparently noticing my look. "Acts up in the cold weather." I nodded sympathetically. I'd been dealing with some stiffness in my own joints lately, an occupational hazard of long hours behind the wheel. But something about his explanation didn't quite sit right with me, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly why. The interstate wound through a series of hills, and my truck's engine worked harder on the grades, the familiar growl of the diesel echoing off the rocky walls that rose on either side of the highway. In the distance I could see the lights of a truck stop, a welcome sight in the lonely darkness. My fuel gauge was getting low, and I could use a bathroom break. "Mind if we stop up ahead?" I asked. "Need to fuel up and take a break." "Of course," he said, but I noticed he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'll just wait in the truck." "Suit yourself," I said, though I found it odd. Most hitchhikers would jump at the chance to stretch their legs and maybe grab a snack or use the facility. I pulled into the truck stop and parked near the fuel pumps. The place was fairly busy despite the late hour, with several other big rigs idling in the lot and the convenience store glowing bright against the darkness. I climbed down from the cab and began fueling up. The diesel fumes mixing with the smell of wet asphalt and the distant aroma of coffee and fried food from inside the store. As I stood there waiting for the tank to fill, I found myself glancing back at my cab. Through the windshield, I could see my passenger sitting motionless, still looking straight ahead. Something about his stillness bothered me, the way he held himself so rigid, like he was concentrating on something, or maybe like he was hiding something. When I finished fueling and went inside to pay, the clerk, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Brenda, looked past me toward my truck. "Friend of yours?" she asked, nodding in that direction. "Picked him up about an hour ago," I said, handing her my credit card. "Why?" She shrugged, but there was something in her expression that made me pause. "Nothing, really. Just thought I recognized him from somewhere. Probably wrong though. We get a lot of people through here." I pocketed my receipt and bought a fresh cup of coffee, but her words stuck with me as I walked back to my truck. The rain had stopped completely now, and the air was crisp and clean, filled with the smell of wet earth and distant sage. My passenger was still sitting in the same position, and as I climbed back into the cab, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten with an inexplicable unease. But surely that was just a trick of the light, or the way the fabric was folded. I shook my head, telling myself that the long night and too much caffeine were making me paranoid. "All set," I said, starting the engine. The big diesel rumbled to life, and I guided the truck back onto the interstate. The highway ahead was clearer now that the rain had stopped, and I could make better time toward Salt Lake. We drove in silence for another 30 miles or so, through countryside that alternated between desert scrub and patches of pine forest. The moon had come out from behind the clouds, casting silver light across the landscape and making long shadows that stretched across the road. It was beautiful in its own stark way, but tonight it seemed somehow ominous, like the shadows were reaching toward us with dark fingers. "Kinder than most people would be, just paying it forward," I replied, though something in his tone made me glance over at him. "We all need help sometime." He turned to look at me then, and in the dim light from the dashboard, I could see that his eyes were filled with a sadness, so deep it seemed to have weight. "Yes," he said quietly, "we do." The collection. From Markusek. The glove box had been rattling for 300 miles, and it was driving me half out of my mind. Every pothole on Interstate 40 sent whatever was loose in there clicking and clacking like dice in a cup, a sound that somehow managed to cut through the steady rumble of my Peterbilt's engine and the low murmur of late-night talk radio. I'd been meaning to check it when I stopped for fuel back in Amarillo, but the line at the truck stop stretched longer than a Sunday sermon, and my dispatcher had been breathing down my neck about delivery times all week. Now, as I rolled through the high desert of New Mexico under a canopy of stars so bright they looked like pinpricks in black velvet, that persistent rattling was starting to feel personal, like whatever was in there knew I was trying to ignore it and was determined to get my attention. The dashboard clock glowed a pale green 2:47 a.m., and I still had 4 hours of driving ahead before I could catch some sleep in Flagstaff. It had developed a rhythm now, almost musical, like someone tapping out Morse code with their fingernails. The sound made my teeth ache, a high-pitched clicking that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. The radio crackled with static as I passed through a dead zone, and in that moment of silence between stations, the rattling seemed impossibly loud. I twisted the dial, searching for something to mask the sound, but found only empty frequencies, full of white noise and the occasional burst of Spanish-language programming from stations hundreds of miles away. Mine was in the shop with a blown transmission, and the company had stuck me with this old 2018 model that smelled like the previous driver's cigarettes and cheap coffee. I didn't know what he might have left behind, didn't know what might be rolling around loose in that glove box. Could be anything: spare change, loose screws from some forgotten repair, Maybe one of those little bottles of aspirin that always seem to lose their cap. Not metallic like coins or plastic like pills, but something with weight and substance. Something that clicked with the hollow resonance of bone against bone. 30 years of long-haul trucking, and I was starting to let my imagination run wild, like some rookie driver spooked by his first midnight run through the mountains. But the sound persisted, and with each passing mile, it seemed to grow more deliberate, more purposeful. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon, empty of traffic except for the occasional pair of headlights approaching from the opposite direction. Out here in the vastness of the desert, it was easy to feel alone with your thoughts, easy to let the darkness creep into the corners of your mind. The engine's steady rumble had always been a comfort to me, a mechanical heartbeat that marked the miles and the hours, but tonight it seemed to provide a bass note accompaniment to that infernal clicking from the glove box. I tried to focus on other things, the way the headlights carved tunnels of light through the darkness, the distant silhouette of mesas against the star-filled sky, the warm flow of air from the heating vents. But my attention kept drifting back to that sound, and the longer I listened, the more convinced I became that there was a pattern to it. 3 quick clicks, followed by 2 slower ones, then a pause. Over and over like a message being tapped out in code. By the time I reached the exit for Gallup, my hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel too tightly, and a headache was building behind my eyes. The truck stop at the off-ramp glowed like a small city in the darkness, harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off chrome and steel and glass. I considered pulling in, stretching my legs, maybe buying a cup of coffee and checking that glove box once and for all. But the delivery schedule was tight, and I'd lost enough time already to construction delays back in Texas. Instead, I reached over and tried the glove box latch, thinking I could open it just enough to peek inside while I drove. But the latch wouldn't budge. I pressed harder, feeling the plastic give slightly under my thumb, but it remained stubbornly closed. Strange, it had opened easily enough when I'd stored my logbook in there at the start of the trip. The rattling seemed to intensify as I struggled with the latch, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard something else mixed in with the clicking. A sound like dry leaves rustling, or paper being crumpled, or perhaps whispering voices too faint to make out words. I jerked my hand away from the glove box and focused on the road, telling myself it was just the wind finding its way through some gap in the truck's weather stripping. As I climbed into the foothills west of Gallup, the rattling took on a new quality. Where before it had been rhythmic and almost musical, now it sounded agitated, urgent, like whatever was in there was trying to get out. The clicking had become a chattering, rapid fire and intense, punctuated by small thumping sounds, as if something was being thrown against the walls of the glove box. The highway curved through rocky outcroppings now, the headlights sweeping across stone formations that looked like sleeping giants in the darkness. This was beautiful country in daylight, all red rocks and endless sky, but at night it felt alien and unwelcome. I tried the radio again, desperate for any distraction, and managed to pick up a station playing old country music. Patsy Cline's voice filled the cab, sweet and melancholy, singing about walking after midnight. But even her golden voice couldn't completely mask the sound from the glove box, which had now become a constant chatter, like teeth clicking together in the cold. That's when it hit me. That's exactly what it sounded like. Teeth chattering. Human teeth, lots of them, rattling against each other with every bump and curve in the road. The realization sent a chill down my spine, and I found myself pressing harder on the accelerator, suddenly eager to reach my destination and be done with this increasingly unsettling ride. But as my speed increased, the chattering grew louder and more frantic. I could hear individual clicks now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, creating a symphony of bone and enamel that made my skin crawl. And underneath it all, that rustling, whispering sound, like voices trying to speak without lips or tongues. The parking area was empty except for one other vehicle, a sedan with out-of-state plates parked near the edge, its windows dark. I pulled the truck as far away from it as possible and killed the engine, but the sudden silence only made the sound from the glove box more pronounced. In the darkness of the cab, with only the faint glow of the instrument panel for light, I sat and listened to that horrible chattering. It was definitely teeth, I was certain now. But whose teeth? And how had they ended up in the glove box of a company truck? I thought about the previous driver, the one whose cigarette smoke still clung to the upholstery. I'd never met him, didn't even know his name. All I knew was that he'd quit suddenly, according to the dispatch, left his truck at a way station in Oklahoma with the keys in the ignition, and never came back for his final paycheck. This time it opened easily, too easily, springing open with such force that its contents spilled out across the passenger seat and floorboard. In the dim light I could see white shapes scattered everywhere, small and irregular, catching what little illumination filtered in from the distant highway light. Human teeth of all kinds, molars and incisors and canines. Some still white and healthy looking, others yellowed with age or darkened with decay. They rolled and clicked against each other as the truck settled on its springs, creating that horrible chattering sound I'd been listening to for hours. The worst part was the papers mixed in with them. Dental records, yellowed and brittle, covered with names and dates and detailed diagrams of human mouths. And photographs, Polaroids mostly, showing people smiling at the camera. Men and women of all ages, all with perfect, complete sets of teeth. The CB that remembers everything. From Marcus A. The hum of my Peterbilt 38.9's engine had become a lullaby over the past 18 years of hauling freight across the interstates. But tonight something felt different as I rolled through the fog-shrouded hills of northern Oregon. Rain drummed steadily against my windshield, the wipers keeping time like a metronome that seemed to be counting down to something I couldn't name. The cargo behind me was nothing unusual, just electronics heading to Seattle, but the weight of the evening pressed down on my shoulders like an invisible load I hadn't signed the manifest for. I'd picked up the CB radio at a truck stop outside of Bakersfield 3 days earlier, replacing my old Cobra that had finally given up the ghost after years of faithful service. The guy behind the counter, a weathered man with oil-stained fingers and eyes that seemed to look right through you, had recommended this particular model, a vintage Midland that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than on my dashboard. The chrome was polished to a mirror shine, and the dial faces were pristine, as if the radio had been waiting in some climate-controlled shrine for decades. Previous owner took real good care of it. Said it picked up signals clearer than anything he'd ever used. He'd quoted me a price that seemed too good for equipment in such condition, and I'd walked out feeling like I'd gotten the deal of the century. Now as I navigated the winding mountain roads with my headlights cutting through the mist, I was beginning to wonder if I'd gotten more than I'd bargained for. The radio had been quiet for most of the drive, just the usual chatter from other drivers reporting road conditions and Smokey Bear locations. But as the clock on my dashboard showed midnight, something started to change. Static crackled through the speaker, not the sharp interference you get from atmospheric conditions, but something softer, more organic, like whispers finding their way through electronic pathways they'd never been meant to travel. I reached for the squelch control, thinking maybe I could clean up the signal, but as my fingers touched the knob, the static resolved into something that made my blood run cold. But the words coming through the speaker were ones I'd never spoken, at least not into this radio. I was hearing myself from 2 years ago, talking to my dispatcher about a load of steel I'd hauled from Pittsburgh to Denver. Every word was exactly as I remembered it, down to the slight rasp in my throat from the head cold I'd been fighting that week. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the conversation played out in perfect detail, my voice mixing with Tom's from dispatch, discussing delivery times and route changes as if the exchange were happening in real time. But Tom had retired 6 months ago, and that load felt like a lifetime ago. The conversation shouldn't exist anywhere except in my memory, certainly not on a CB radio I'd only owned for 3 days. The transmission faded back into static, and I convinced myself it had to be some kind of strange atmospheric phenomenon. Radio waves bouncing around the mountains and somehow playing back old conversations. It was thin logic, but it was better than the alternatives my mind was beginning to suggest. I turned the volume down and tried to focus on the road, watching for the exit that would take me down toward the Columbia River and eventually to my delivery point in Seattle. 20 minutes later, as I descended through a valley where the fog hung so thick I could barely see the taillights of the car ahead of me, the static returned, and this time it brought voices I recognized but hadn't heard in years. My father's voice came through first, that familiar Detroit accent roughened by decades of Lucky Strikes, talking to someone about a fishing trip we'd taken when I was 12 years old. The conversation was one I'd never heard before. My father speaking to his brother about how worried he was about me, how I'd been quiet since my mother died, how he didn't know how to help a grieving boy understand why good people sometimes leave too soon. His voice carried a weight of sadness I'd never heard when I was young, the kind of pain adults hide from children but carry with them like stones in their pocket. My uncle's voice responded, offering the kind of gentle advice one brother gives another, suggesting patience and time and the importance of just being present. It was a conversation that had probably taken place over CB radios during one of their long-haul runs together, back when I thought my father was the strongest man in the world, and couldn't imagine that he might be scared or uncertain about anything. Both men had been dead for over a decade now, my father taken by the cancer that seems to hunt long-haul drivers like a predator that knows their habits. My uncle following 2 years later when his heart finally gave out on him somewhere outside of Amarillo. Hearing their voices again, discussing their worries about a boy who had grown up to follow them into the same profession that had eventually claimed them both, felt like receiving a letter that had been lost in the mail for 30 years. The transmission faded, leaving me alone with the sound of rain and the steady rumble of my engine. I pulled over at the next rest area, parking under the dim glow of sodium lights that made the fog look like it was made of amber. My hands were shaking as I poured coffee from my thermos, the liquid sloshing slightly as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. The logical part of my mind kept insisting there had to be an explanation, some technical reason why this radio was picking up old transmission. Maybe the previous owner had recorded conversations, and somehow the playback function was engaging randomly. But the voices were too clear, too emotionally real, and some of the conversations I was hearing were ones I'd never been privy to, discussions that had taken place when I was miles away, or years too young to understand their significance. I was about to get back on the road when the radio crackled to life again, and this time the voice that came through the speaker made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was Sarah, my ex-wife, but not as she'd sounded during our marriage, or even during the bitter months of our divorce. This was her voice from the phone call I'd never answered, the one that had come in while I was hauling furniture from Phoenix to Portland, 3 days before she died. I'd been running behind schedule and had let the call go to voicemail, planning to call her back when I reached my delivery point. But by the time I'd gotten around to listening to the message, she was already gone, killed by a drunk driver who'd run a red light while she was walking home from her job at the hospital. I'd erased the voicemail without ever returning the call, too consumed by guilt to hear whatever her last words to me had been. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, the way it used to sound when she was trying to work up the courage to talk about something important. She was telling someone, maybe a friend or maybe just speaking to herself, about how she'd been thinking about calling me, how she'd realized that despite everything that had gone wrong between us, she still cared about me and wanted to make sure I was taking care of myself out on the road. She talked about how she'd seen a news story about a truck accident in Nevada and had felt her heart stop until she'd confirmed it wasn't me. How she'd realized that somewhere beneath all the anger and hurt feelings, she still worried about the man she'd once loved enough to marry. She'd been planning to apologize for some of the things she'd said during our last fight, to see if maybe we could find a way to be friends again, or at least to not carry so much pain between us. The transmission was clearer than any of the others had been, so real I could hear her breathing between words, could catch the slight tremor in her voice that meant she was fighting back tears. It was exactly how she'd sounded during the vulnerable moments of our relationship, when she'd let her guard down enough to show me the tender heart she usually kept protected. As her voice faded back into static, I realized I was crying, tears I'd been holding back for years finally finding their way down my cheeks. The radio fell silent for several minutes, and I sat there in my truck, surrounded by fog and the ghost of a woman who died, thinking I didn't care enough to call her back. It was my own voice again, but older somehow, seasoned with years I hadn't lived yet. I was talking to someone I couldn't identify, discussing a decision I was apparently planning to make. Something about finally hanging up the keys and settling down somewhere the roads couldn't call to me anymore. This version of myself sounded tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion, worn down by years of solitude and the weight of all the conversations that had gone unfinished. The gauge that whispered. From Marcus Oak. The needle on my fuel gauge has always been my most trusted companion during these long hauls across the interstate highways that snake through the heart of America. 23 years I've been driving this Kenworth W900, and in all that time, the gauge has never lied to me, never left me stranded, never given me reason to doubt its simple mechanical honesty. The little white needle would drift from full to half, from half to quarter, and when it kissed that red zone marked empty, I knew I had maybe 30 miles left in the tank, if I was careful with the throttle and gentle with the hills. But tonight something is different. Tonight, as I cruise through the rain-soaked darkness of rural Montana, with a load of refrigerated goods bound for Seattle, the gauge is behaving in ways that make my hands tighten on the steering wheel, and my heart beat just a little faster than the steady rhythm of the diesel engine beneath my feet. The needle isn't just moving to empty and staying there like it should when the tank runs low. Instead, it's dancing, trembling, vibrating with an intensity that seems almost alive, almost urgent, as if it's trying to tell me something beyond the simple mathematics of fuel consumption. The rain drumming against my windshield creates a hypnotic pattern of sound and light as the wipers sweep back and forth in their endless rhythm, and through this liquid curtain, I can barely make out the road markers that tell me I'm still heading west on interstate, still making good time despite the weather. My CB radio crackles occasionally with distant voices of other drivers fighting their way through this same storm, but their conversations fade in and out like ghosts whispering secrets I'm not meant to hear. The fuel gauge continues its strange dance, the needle swinging wildly between half full and completely empty, as if it can't decide which reality it wants to show me. I tap the glass face of the gauge with my knuckle, the way my father taught me to do with stubborn instruments when I was just a boy learning about engines and machines in his garage back in Ohio. Sometimes a gentle tap can bring a wayward gauge back to its senses, reminded of its purpose, coax it into telling the truth again. But this time, the tapping seems to make things worse. The needle begins to move in slow, deliberate arcs, sweeping from one side of the gauge to the other in a motion that looks less like mechanical failure and more like a clock hand counting down to something I don't understand. The truck stop I've been aiming for should be coming up soon, according to my GPS, a little place called Desert Rose Fuel that sits at the junction of the interstate and a state highway that leads north into the wilderness areas where few people choose to live. I've stopped there before during previous runs, and I remember it as a clean, well-lit establishment with friendly staff and decent coffee, the kind of place that makes you feel welcome even at 3 in the morning when the rest of the world is asleep. But as I peer through the rain and darkness, searching for the familiar glow of neon signs and the comforting sight of other trucks parked under the bright canopy lights, I see something that makes me slow down and lean forward against the steering wheel. The truck stop is there, exactly where it should be, but something about it looks wrong, in ways that I struggle to identify at first. The lights are on, casting their usual pool of artificial daylight across the wet asphalt, and I can see the familiar shapes of fuel pumps standing in neat rows, like soldiers at attention. The building itself appears normal, with its plate glass windows glowing warmly and the reassuring outline of the convenience store visible inside. But there are no other trucks parked there, no cars at the gas pumps, no signs of human activity, despite the late hour when places like this usually see steady traffic from drivers like me, who travel through the night. As I guide my truck toward the diesel pumps, the fuel gauge suddenly stops its erratic movement and drops to empty with a finality that makes my stomach clench with worry. The needle doesn't just drift down gradually as it should when the tank runs dry. Instead, it falls like a stone, disappearing below the empty mark, as if the gauge is trying to show me something beyond mere emptiness, something worse than running out of fuel. I've felt the engine cough and stutter before when the tank gets low, felt the way the truck begins to lose power and momentum as it struggles to draw the last drops from the bottom of the fuel system. But right now the engine purrs with the smooth confidence of a machine that has plenty to drink, making the gauge's insistence on showing empty seem less like mechanical reality and more like some kind of warning. I pull up to the pump and shut down the engine, listening to the sudden silence that follows the cessation of the diesel's constant rumble. The rain continues its assault on the truck's metal surfaces, creating a percussion symphony that echoes off the canopy overhead. Through my side window I can see the fuel pump standing ready, its digital display dark and waiting for someone to begin the familiar ritual of filling a tank and moving on down the road. But something about the pump looks different tonight, older somehow, as if it's been weathered by years of use despite the fact that I remember it being relatively new during my last visit. I grab my fuel card and climbing down from the cab, feeling the rain immediately begin to soak through my jacket and run down the back of my neck with cold fingers that make me shiver. The pavement beneath my boots is slick with water and something else, something that makes each step feel uncertain and treacherous. As I approach the pump, I notice that the digital display flickers to life before I even insert my card, showing numbers that scroll rapidly across the screen like a slot machine, searching for the right combination. The numbers aren't prices or gallons, or any other measurement that belongs on a fuel pump. Instead, they look like coordinates, or dates, or maybe some kind of code that I lack the knowledge to decipher. When I slide my fuel card into the reader, the pump responds with a series of electronic beeps and chirps that sound wrong, too high-pitched and rapid, like the distressed calls of some digital creature in pain. The screen flashes a message that I have to read twice before I believe what I'm seeing. Tank already empty. Cannot fill what does not exist. I stare at these words, feeling the rain run down my face, and trying to understand what they could possibly mean. My truck has a fuel tank, a large one that holds enough diesel to carry me hundreds of miles between stops. I've filled it countless times at countless stations across the country. The tank exists. It's real. It's mounted securely beneath the chassis where it's always been. I walk back to my truck and check the fuel tank directly, running my hands along its metal surface and listening for the familiar slosh of liquid inside when I rock the vehicle gently by pushing against the bumper. But there's no sound, no movement of fluid, nothing to indicate that there's anything inside the tank at all. When I tap on the metal with my knuckles, it rings with the hollow sound of empty space, as if the tank has been drained completely despite the fact that I filled it less than 400 miles ago, and my engine has been running normally the entire time. Back inside the cab, I try to start the engine again, expecting it to turn over a few times, and then die as the fuel system fails to find anything to feed the hungry cylinders. But the engine starts immediately, settling into its familiar idle, with no signs of fuel starvation or mechanical distress. The fuel gauge, however, has moved beyond empty now, the needle pointing to a position that shouldn't exist on the instrument, somewhere past the physical limits of the gauge's design, as if it's trying to indicate a state of emptiness, so profound that normal measurements cannot contain it. I grab my CB radio and call out to any other drivers who might be listening, hoping to hear a familiar voice that can offer explanation or advice about what I'm experiencing. Breaker 19. This is westbound Willie looking for a copy. Anybody out there got their ears on? But the radio responds with only static, a white noise that seems to carry faint voices speaking words I cannot quite understand, as if there are conversations happening just beyond the edge of perception, in frequencies that human ears were never meant to receive. The convenience store beckons through the rain, its windows glowing with warm light that promises normalcy and human contact, and perhaps answers to the questions that are multiplying in my mind, like viruses replicating in a computer system. I decide to leave the truck running, partly because I'm afraid it won't start again if I shut it off, and partly because the sound of the engine provides a comforting anchor to reality in a situation that seems to be drifting further from the normal world with each passing minute. The walk to the store entrance feels longer than it should, as if the distance is stretching with each step, and the automatic doors hesitate before opening, as if the sensors are having trouble recognizing my approach. Inside, the store appears normal at first glance, with aisles of snacks and supplies arranged in the familiar pattern of truck stops across America. But as I look more closely, I notice that many of the shelves are empty, not recent. The Breathing Highway, from Marcus Wayland. The first thing you notice when you've been driving the interstate for 23 years is how roads have their own personality. Some stretch out confident and straight, others wind through mountains like nervous conversations. But I'd never encountered a road that seemed alive until that October night on Route 47, somewhere between Bakersfield and nowhere, when the asphalt beneath my 18-wheeler began to breathe. I was hauling a load of furniture from a warehouse closure. Nothing unusual about the cargo or the destination. The weather had been clear when I'd started the run, but as midnight approached, a peculiar fog began rolling in from the desert hills. Not the usual marine layer you'd expect in California, but something thicker, more deliberate in the way it moved across the highway. My Kenworth's headlights barely penetrated 20 feet ahead, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The fog seemed to muffle everything. The familiar rumble of my diesel engine sounded distant and hollow, as if the sound was being absorbed by something hungry. Even the CB radio, usually crackling with chatter from other night drivers, had gone completely silent. I tried raising anyone, on channel 19, but received only static that seemed to pulse with an odd rhythm, like a slow heartbeat transmitted through radio waves. In the sweep of my headlights, the asphalt appeared to be moving in subtle waves, like water disturbed by something large passing beneath. I blinked hard, figuring fatigue was playing tricks on my vision, but the movement persisted. The double yellow lines seemed to undulate gently, rising and falling in a pattern that reminded me uncomfortably of breathing. I eased off the accelerator, bringing my rig down from 65 to 45 miles per hour. Through the fog, I could make out the occasional reflective post marking the roadside, but they seemed to bend and sway as if the very ground they were planted in was shifting. The sensation was nauseating, like trying to walk on the deck of a ship in heavy seas, except I was supposedly on solid ground. Something about this stretch of highway was wrong in a way that went beyond poor visibility or road condition. The fog pressed against my windshield with an almost tangible weight, and when I turned on the wipers to clear away moisture, they left behind streaks that looked disturbingly organic, like the slime trail of some enormous creature. The exit signs, when they appeared through the murk, were illegible. The letters seemed to shift and blur even when I was close enough that I should have been able to read them clearly. Mile marker posts flashed by at irregular intervals, and I began to suspect they weren't following normal sequential numbering. I saw marker 37, then 349, then 343, as if the highway itself couldn't decide where it was supposed to be. As I continued driving, the breathing motion of the road became more pronounced. I could feel it through the suspension of my truck now, a gentle but persistent rising and falling that made my cargo shift uneasily in the trailer behind me. The rhythm was too regular to be natural settling or thermal expansion. It felt deliberate, purposeful, like something enormous was sleeping beneath the asphalt, and my truck was nothing more than a flea on its back. I tried to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe there was underground mining in the area, causing subsidence. Maybe thermal vents were creating unusual air pressure. Maybe the fog was some kind of industrial accident that was affecting my perception. But even as I cycled through these possibilities, I knew none of them explained what I was experiencing. The temperature gauge on my dashboard began to fluctuate wildly, swinging from normal operating range to the red zone and back again, despite the fact that my engine sounded fine. My speedometer needle started to drift, showing different speeds even though my foot remained steady on the accelerator. Most unsettling of all, my compass began spinning slowly in lazy circles, as if magnetic north had become a moving target. Through the fog, I began to see shapes moving alongside the highway. At first I thought they might be deer or other wildlife, but they moved with a fluid grace that seemed wrong for any animal I knew. They kept pace with my truck effortlessly, dark forms that seemed to flow rather than run. When I tried to focus on them directly, they would fade back into the fog, but I could sense them there in my peripheral vision, watching and following. The road's breathing grew deeper and more pronounced. I could hear it now, a vast inhalation and exhalation that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound was like wind through a canyon, but with an organic quality that made my skin crawl. My truck rose and fell with each breath, and I had to constantly adjust my steering to maintain a straight course as the lane lines shifted beneath me. That's when I noticed the mile markers counting backward. I was moving forward at a steady 40 miles per hour, according to my speedometer, but somehow traveling in reverse, according to the highway markers. The GPS unit on my dashboard had long since given up, showing only a blank screen with the message "Location unavailable" blinking endlessly. The fog began to take on a yellowish tinge, and with it came a smell that crept into my cab, despite the closed windows and recirculating air. It was organic and warm, like the breath of something vast sleeping in the sun. The odor made me slightly dizzy, and I had to crack a window to get fresh air, though what flowed in wasn't much better. As I crested what felt like a gentle hill, though I couldn't see any elevation change through the fog, my headlights illuminated something that made me slam on the brake. Stretched across the highway was what looked like a massive rib, white and curved, rising from the asphalt on one side and disappearing into the fog on the other. It was easily 20 feet high at its peak, and completely blocked the road. My truck shuddered to a halt, air brakes hissing, and I sat staring at this impossible obstacle. The rib was clearly ancient, weathered and pitted, but it seemed to pulse faintly with the same rhythm as the road's breathing. As I watched, paralyzed with disbelief, another rib began to emerge from the asphalt behind the first, rising slowly like a time-lapse film of growing bones. The shapes I had seen in the fog were clearer now, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't moving alongside the highway. They were part of it. Long, sinuous forms that might have been blood vessels or nerves stretched parallel to the road, pulsing with dim phosphorescence. The yellow fog swirled around them like circulation in some enormous respiratory system. I threw my truck into reverse, twin stacks belching black smoke as I pushed the diesel hard. The breathing sound grew agitated, faster and more labored, as if whatever I was driving on was beginning to wake up. The road surface beneath my tires became spongy and unstable, and I felt my trailer begin to slide sideways as the asphalt rippled like disturbed water. In my mirrors I could see more ribs emerging behind me, a cage of bone rising from the highway that would trap me if I didn't move fast enough. The fog was growing thicker and more acrid, and the organic smell was becoming overwhelming. My engine coughed and sputtered, as if the air itself was becoming too thick to support combustion. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, feeling my truck lean dangerously as I tried to the highway proper and onto what I hoped was the shoulder. My tires found purchase on ground that felt more solid, less alive, and I gunned the engine, pushing through scrub brush and around the emerging bone structure. My trailer scraped against something that gave way with a sound like tearing flesh, but I kept moving, desperate to get back to normal road. The fog began to thin as I bounced and lurched across the desert floor parallel to the highway. Through the clearing air I could see the true scope of what I had been driving on. The entire stretch of highway was transforming, revealing itself to be the spine of something unimaginably vast. Ribs rose in perfect sequence, and what I had taken for hills in the distance were actually the curve of impossible shoulders. The road had never been a road at all, but the backbone of some sleeping titan. I managed to reconnect with the interstate several miles ahead, where the asphalt seemed normal and solid once again. My hands were shaking as I checked my CB radio and found the familiar chatter of truckers discussing traffic conditions and weather report. My GPS flickered back to life, showing my location as a simple dot on a perfectly ordinary highway map. But when I called my dispatcher the next morning to report the detour, he looked up the route logs and told me something that still keeps me awake some night. According to the official records, there is no Route 47 running between Bakersfield and my delivery point. The highway I thought I had been traveling doesn't exist on any map. The mirror with its own sky. From Marcus Holloway. The thing about driving the same road for 15 years is that you stop seeing the road and start seeing patterns. Highway 287 northbound from Denver to Laramie had become as familiar to me as the lines on my palm. Every mile marker and exit ramp burned into memory like scripture. My Peterbilt 379 hummed its steady diesel song through the Colorado night, headlights carving through darkness that seemed thicker than usual for this time of October. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, their voices like lonely ghosts drifting across the frequencies. It was just past 2 in the morning when I first noticed something wrong with my passenger side mirror. Nothing dramatic, mind you, just a flicker in my peripheral vision, like when you think you see movement in a photograph. I'd been hauling a load of construction equipment to Casper, running on schedule and feeling good about making it home before my daughter's soccer game Saturday afternoon. The coffee was still warm in my thermos. Classic rock played softly on the radio, and the October air carried that crisp promise of winter that always made me nostalgic for something I couldn't quite name. The mirror caught my attention again as I passed mile marker. This time I looked directly at it, adjusting my position in the driver's seat to get a better angle. What I saw made me ease off the throttle slightly, my engine's rumble dropping to a lower register. The reflection showed the expected view of the highway behind me, my trailer's running lights glowing red in the darkness. But above that familiar scene, where the star-scattered Colorado sky should have been, stretched something else entirely. It looked like daylight, but not quite right. Too bright, too blue, with clouds that moved in fast forward across an expanse that seemed to stretch infinitely upward. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes with the back of my hand, and looked again. The normal nighttime sky filled my windshield and driver's side mirror, but that passenger mirror stubbornly displayed its own impossible heavens above the darkened highway. 15 years of long hauls teach you to recognize when your mind starts playing tricks. I'd pulled over for hallucinations before, caught a few hours of sleep in the cab, and woken up with everything back to normal. But my body felt alert, my hands steady on the wheel. I'd only been driving 6 hours since my last mandatory break, and I'd gotten solid sleep at the truck stop in Colorado Springs. The highway scene moved accordingly, but that impossible sky remained constant, as if it existed in some fixed position above a road that wasn't quite the one I was traveling. The clouds in that other sky cast shadows that fell across the reflected asphalt in patterns that didn't match the darkness surrounding me. The radio crackled, and a voice emerged from the static. "Eastbound Peterbilt at marker 19-4. You got your ears on?" I grabbed the handset, grateful for human contact in the growing strangeness of the night. "This is northbound Peterbilt, go ahead," I replied, glancing at the mirror again. The daylight sky had taken on a golden quality, like late afternoon sunshine. "You seeing anything weird out there, driver? My mirrors are showing me things that ain't making sense." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm air blowing from the heater vents. "What kind of things?" "Sky's all wrong in my passenger side, showing daylight when it ought to be showing stars. Been like that for the last 20 miles. I keyed the mic again, my voice steadier than I felt. "Copy that, eastbound. I'm seeing the same thing. You got any ideas what might cause something like that?" Static answered me for several seconds before his voice returned, fainter now as distance grew between us. "No idea, friend, but I'm keeping my eyes on the road ahead. Whatever's in that mirror, it ain't our sky." After he signed off, the night felt lonelier than before. I tried focusing on familiar landmarks, grounding myself in the known world. There was the billboard for Rocky Mountain Insurance, the same faded advertisement I'd seen twice a month for 3 years. There was the exit for Wellington, still 12 miles ahead. Everything matched my expectations, except for that passenger mirror, which now showed puffy white clouds drifting across an azure sky that belonged to some other season, some other time of day. As I climbed the gentle grade toward the Wyoming border, something new appeared in the mirror's impossible sky. At first I thought it might be birds, dark specks moving against those two bright clouds. But as I watched, fighting to keep most of my attention on the dark road ahead, the specks grew larger and more defined. They weren't birds. They looked like aircraft, but not any design I recognized. Sleek in silver, moving in formations that seemed both purposeful and alien. My truck's engine began to labor slightly, though the grade wasn't steep enough to warrant it. The dashboard lights flickered once, then steadied. I downshifted, giving the old Caterpillar more power, but the sensation of struggling against some invisible resistance remained. It felt like driving through thick air, as if the atmosphere itself had grown dense around my rig. They cast no shadows on the reflected highway, which should have been impossible given the bright daylight they moved through. I found myself dividing my attention dangerously between the dark road ahead and the increasingly active scene playing out in that passenger side mirror. Then I saw the exit that shouldn't exist. It appeared in the mirror's reflection of the road behind me, a concrete off-ramp leading away from the highway into that world of perpetual daylight. The exit had no corresponding structure in reality when I twisted around to look through the actual rear window of my cab. The real highway stretched empty behind me, just dark asphalt and the distant glow of Denver on the southern horizon. But in the mirror, vehicles were taking that impossible exit. Cars and trucks that had never passed me were peeling off the highway into that other realm, disappearing up a ramp that led toward those silver aircraft and those two bright clouds. I watched a sedan that looked like my neighbor's Honda Civic climb the ramp and fade into the golden light. A pickup truck followed, then a semi-trailer that could have been twins to my own rig. My hands were gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make my knuckles ache. The smart thing would have been to pull over, maybe find an all-night diner, and wait for sunrise to burn away whatever strangeness had infected this stretch of highway. But something kept me driving forward. Some combination of curiosity and the trucker's stubborn need to stay on schedule. The resistance against my forward motion grew stronger. My engine temperature gauge crept upward, though not into the danger zone. The radio filled with static that almost sounded like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Through it all, that passenger mirror continued showing its impossible sky, now filled with so many silver aircraft that they formed clouds of their own. It moved slowly, deliberately, growing larger as it dropped toward the reflected highway. I could see details now that made my breath catch in my throat. The craft was perfectly smooth, with no visible windows or markings, its surface reflecting the golden light of that other sky. It settled onto the mirrored asphalt directly behind my reflected trailer, matching my speed exactly. In the real world, my trailer's rear cameras and my driver's side mirror showed only empty highway. But the passenger mirror insisted that I was being followed by something that had descended from an alien sky into a version of reality that existed only in reflection. The craft began to emit a light of its own, a soft blue glow that seemed to pull at the edges of the mirror's frame. I felt a peculiar sensation, as if something was tugging at my truck from the side, trying to guide me toward the shoulder. My steering wheel wanted to turn right, though I fought to keep the rig centered in my lane. That's when I noticed my own reflection beginning to change. In the passenger mirror I could see the side of my cab, the familiar red and chrome of my Peterbilt, but the truck in the reflection was subtly different. cleaner, somehow. The small dent near the fuel tank was gone. The mud flaps looked new. Even my own face, visible through the side window of the reflected cab, looked younger, more rested. Part of me wanted to give in, to see where that impossible exit led, to drive up the ramp into that world of perpetual daylight and silver aircraft. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but they seemed to come from very far away. I was nearly at the Wyoming border when I made my choice. Instead of fighting the pull any longer, I yanked the wheel hard to the left, taking my truck. The Shadowless Mile. From Jake Morrison. The CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of 3 hours when I first heard mention of Miller's Junction. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods from Portland down to Sacramento, running my usual overnight route in my old Peterbilt, when the familiar voices of other drivers started buzzing about this rest stop that none of us had seen before. Big Mike, who'd been running these highways longer than I'd been alive, swore it had just appeared somewhere along the stretch of Interstate 5 that we all knew like the backs of our hands. The autumn rain had been steady that night, drumming against my windshield in a rhythm that matched the low hum of my diesel engine. My wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic dance, clearing the glass just long enough for me to catch glimpses of the dark California countryside rolling past. The yellow glow of my dashboard instruments cast everything in a warm, amber light, and the gentle vibration of the cab usually helped keep me alert during these long hauls. But something felt different that night, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. When I first spotted the blue and white sign for Miller's Junction Rest Area, I almost drove past it without thinking. The sign looked official enough, with that familiar design that marked rest stops all along the interstate system. But as my headlights swept over it, I noticed something odd about the lettering. The paint looked fresh, almost wet in the rain, as if someone had just finished putting it up. The reflective material caught my beams and threw them back with an unusual intensity that made me blink and adjust my mirrors. The Department of Transportation regulations were clear about mandatory rest periods, and I had always been careful to follow them to the letter. A rest stop would be perfect timing, even if it was one I had never seen before. Sometimes new facilities opened up along familiar routes, and it wasn't unusual for drivers to discover them during their regular run. The exit ramp curved gently to the right, and my air brakes hissed softly as I downshifted and guided my rig toward what appeared to be a fairly standard rest area layout. There were the usual amenities visible in the distance: a main building with vending machines, picnic tables scattered around the grounds, and several parking areas designated for both automobiles and commercial vehicles. The whole place was lit by those tall sodium vapor lights that cast everything in that peculiar orange glow that seems to exist nowhere else but highway rest stops at night. As I maneuvered my truck into one of the designated spaces and set my parking brake, I noticed that there were several other vehicles scattered throughout the rest area. A few cars sat in the automobile section, their occupants presumably inside the main building, or walking their dogs in the designated pet area. Two other big rigs were parked in the truck section, their running lights glowing softly in the dark. Everything appeared normal and welcoming after hours of rain-soaked highway driving. But as I stepped down from my cab and my boots hit the wet pavement, the first strange thing became apparent. The rain was still falling steadily. I could feel it on my shoulders and hear it pattering against the metal roof of the covered walkway that led to the main building. Yet when I looked around the rest area, something was fundamentally wrong with the way the light was behaving. The tall sodium vapor lamps were burning brightly overhead, casting their usual orange illumination across the grounds, but nothing was casting shadows. I stood there for a moment, blinking the rain out of my eyes and trying to process what I was seeing. The picnic tables, the trash receptacles, the other vehicles, even my own truck behind me, all were clearly visible in the artificial light, but none of them were casting any shadows whatsoever. It was as if the light was coming from everywhere at once, eliminating any possibility of shadow formation. I had never seen anything like it in 30 years of highway driving. Walking slowly toward the main building, I kept looking around, trying to find some explanation for this optical phenomenon. Perhaps there were hidden lights positioned at unusual angles, or maybe some kind of special illumination system had been installed as part of an experimental design. But the more I observed, the more unsettling it became. Even when I held my hand up directly in front of one of the light poles, blocking the illumination, no shadow appeared on the ground beneath it. Inside the main building, the fluorescent lighting seemed normal enough, though I noticed that here too, the absence of shadows continued. The vending machines, the information displays, the rows of plastic chairs near the windows, all were lit but cast no shadows on the floor or wall. A few other travelers were moving around inside, feeding coins into the vending machines or using the restroom facilities, and they too seemed to exist in this strange, shadowless environment. I approached the information desk where a middle-aged woman in a Park Service uniform was sorting through some brochures. She looked up at me with a pleasant smile and asked if there was anything she could help me with. Her voice sounded perfectly normal, and her demeanor was friendly and professional, exactly what you would expect from someone working at a highway rest facility. But like everything else in this place, she cast no shadow, even though the fluorescent lights were clearly shining down on her from above. She explained that Miller's Junction was a pilot program for a new type of illumination system designed to improve safety and reduce accidents at rest areas. The technology eliminated harsh shadows that could hide potential hazards or create blind spots where problems might develop. It sounded reasonable enough, though I had never heard of such a system before, and I made it my business to stay current with developments in highway safety and infrastructure. After purchasing a cup of coffee from one of the vending machines, I decided to take a walk around the grounds before settling in for my mandatory rest period. The rain had lightened to a gentle mist, and the air felt clean and cool against my face. But as I wandered among the picnic tables and landscaped areas, the absence of shadows continued to create an increasingly surreal atmosphere. Everything looked flattened somehow, as if I were walking through a photograph rather than a three-dimensional space. Near the edge of the rest area, where the manicured grounds gave way to natural vegetation, I encountered another truck driver, a woman about my age, who was walking a small dog near the pet exercise area. She introduced herself as Carmen and explained that she had been driving for nearly 20 years, mostly running loads between Los Angeles and Seattle. When I asked her about the lighting system, she gave me a long, thoughtful look before glancing around at the shadowless landscape surrounding us. Carmen told me that she had stopped at Miller's Junction twice before, both times during overnight runs when she needed to take her required rest break. She had noticed the unusual lighting immediately, just as I had, but when she asked other drivers about it on the CB radio, none of them seemed to know what she was talking about. Some claimed they had never seen any rest area called Miller's Junction, despite the fact that she was certain she had passed the same blue and white signs that had directed me here tonight. As we talked, her small dog became increasingly agitated, pulling at its leash and whining softly, while looking toward the tree line that bordered the rest area. The animal's behavior was subtle but persistent, and Carmen mentioned that this had happened during her previous visits as well. The dog always became nervous here, though it was normally calm and well-behaved at other rest stops along their regular route. But now I realized that they were following the exact same patterns they had been following when I first arrived. The man at the vending machines was feeding the same coins into the same slot. The woman reading brochures near the information desk was turning the same pages in the same sequence. The family with small children near the restroom area was having what appeared to be the identical conversation they had been having an hour ago. When I approached the vending machine area, the man who had been buying snacks looked up at me with the same pleasant expression I had seen before, and asked the exact same question about whether I knew if the machine accepted $20 bill. His voice carried the same inflection, and when I responded differently than I had before, he seemed not to notice, and continued with what appeared to be a scripted interaction. The woman at the information desk was still there as well, still sorting through the same brochures with the same mechanical movements. When I asked her again about the lighting system, she gave me the identical explanation about the pilot program and safety improvements, using precisely the same words and phrases. But this time I noticed that her eyes never quite focused on me directly, as if she were looking at something just slightly to my left or right. Outside, the sodium vapor lights continued to burn with their strange, shadowless illumination, and the rain had settled into a fine mist that seemed to hang in the air without. Waves from Tomorrow, from Marcus Rivera. The old Peterbilt's radio had been acting up for weeks, cycling through static and fragments of broadcasts that never quite made sense. I'd been meaning to get it fixed at the next truck stop, but money was tight, and the radio still worked well enough to keep me company during those long stretches of highway between Denver and Salt Lake City. The mountains rose like sleeping giants on either side of Interstate 70, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds that promised snow before morning. The voice came through clear as crystal, cutting through the static like a knife through fog. Good evening, this is KTWR with your extended forecast. Tomorrow, November 15th, expect heavy snow accumulation along Interstate 70, with visibility dropping to near zero by 6 a.m. Multiple vehicle accidents reported near Vail Pass, including a jackknifed semi blocking both westbound lanes. Nothing unusual in there except for one small detail that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The forecast was calling for snow tomorrow, November 15th, but according to every weather app on my phone, tomorrow was supposed to be clear and dry. I'd checked 3 different services before starting this run. Not a cloud in the digital sky. The radio crackled, and the voice continued with an unnatural calm that seemed to seep into my bones. Traffic advisory for Tuesday morning: avoid the eastbound rest area at mile marker. Facilities will be temporarily closed due to an ongoing investigation. The announcer paused, and in that brief silence, I could hear something that sounded almost like breathing. We'll have more updates as they become available. This has been KTWR, your voice from tomorrow. Your voice from tomorrow. That phrase echoed in my mind as I tried to find the station again, spinning the dial through nothing but static and the distant whisper of late-night talk shows. KTWR wasn't coming through anymore, as if it had never existed at all. But I'd heard it clearly, hadn't I? The forecast, the traffic advisory, that strange tagline that made no meteorological sense whatsoever. The Peterbilt's engine hummed its familiar lullaby, 18 wheels eating up the miles with mechanical precision. I'd been driving trucks for 15 years, knew every curve and grade of this route like the lines on my weathered hand. Nothing about tonight felt different, except for that radio transmission that had left me with a creeping sense of unease I couldn't shake. Mile after mile disappeared beneath my wheels, and I found myself checking the clock obsessively, watching as the hours crawled toward dawn. The radio remained silent, except for the usual late-night programming, classic rock and call-in shows that felt reassuringly normal. But every few minutes I'd catch myself reaching for the dial, searching for that clear, calm voice that had spoken of tomorrow with such unsettling certainty. By 4 a.m. I was beginning to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Fatigue could play tricks on a driver's mind, turn static into voices and transform random noise into coherent sentences. I'd been pushing hard to make my delivery deadline, maybe harder than I should have. The human brain wasn't designed to process highway hypnosis and radio waves at the same time, especially not in the dead hours before dawn, when reality felt thin as mountain air. It started as a few lazy flakes drifting across my windshield, barely visible in the headlight beams. Within minutes it had intensified into a steady snowfall that coated the asphalt in a treacherous white film. My wipers worked frantically to keep the windshield clear, their rhythmic scraping adding a nervous percussion to the engine's steady drone. The GPS on my dashboard showed clear skies across the entire region, but the evidence was accumulating on my windshield faster than the wipers could clear it away. I reduced my speed and tightened my grip on the wheel, feeling the subtle shift in the road surface as snow began to stick. Other vehicles had slowed as well, their taillights creating red ghosts in the swirling white. The weather was deteriorating exactly as the radio had predicted, even though every official forecast had called for dry conditions. My phone showed no weather alerts, no warnings. Nothing to suggest that this sudden storm had been anticipated by anyone except that mysterious KTWR announcer. Red and blue emergency lights flashed through the falling snow like Christmas decorations in hell. A jackknifed semi blocked both westbound lanes, exactly as the radio had predicted. State patrol officers directed traffic into a single lane, their reflective gear glowing ghostly in the storm. The accident looked fresh, probably less than an hour old, but the radio had described it as if it had already happened. I crawled past the scene in the slow-moving line of detoured traffic, close enough to see the details that would stick in my memory for years to come. The overturned trailer bore the logo of a shipping company I recognized, and the tractor was a blue Kenworth with custom chrome that caught the emergency lights like scattered diamonds. The driver stood beside a patrol car, apparently uninjured but wrapped in an emergency blanket that fluttered in the wind like broken wings. The radio crackled to life as I cleared the accident scene, that same calm voice cutting through the static with surgical precision. This is KTWR with an update on Tuesday's weather. Snow accumulation will continue through dawn, with conditions improving by mid-morning. Drivers should exercise extreme caution, particularly in the vicinity of mile marker 20, where ongoing investigations may cause delay. Mile marker 20. I checked my GPS and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature outside. I was approaching mile marker 20, which meant the eastbound rest area mentioned in the earlier broadcast was less than a mile ahead. The rest area where facilities would be closed due to an ongoing investigation. An investigation that, according to the radio, hadn't happened yet. My logical mind raced through possible explanations, each more unsettling than the last. Maybe KTWR was some kind of emergency broadcast system connected to police scanners and weather monitoring equipment that could predict incidents before they were reported to the public. Maybe there were investigators already en route to the rest area for some unrelated reason. Maybe the storm had been anticipated by meteorologists who simply hadn't updated their public forecasts in time. But even as I constructed these rational explanations, a deeper part of my consciousness was processing the impossible truth. The radio wasn't predicting tomorrow's events. It was reporting them as if they had already occurred in some parallel timeline, where cause and effect operated by different rules. The announcer wasn't forecasting the future, he was broadcasting from it, sending messages backward through time, like bottles thrown into a temporal ocean. The rest area peered through the swirling snow, its familiar blue signs promising fuel, food, and facilities for weary drivers. But as my headlights swept across the parking lot, I saw that it was indeed closed, blocked by orange cones and official vehicles that hadn't been there when I'd passed this way on previous run. State patrol cars formed a perimeter around something near the main building, their emergency lights painting the falling snow in alternating waves of red and blue. I slowed but didn't stop, watching the scene unfold through my passenger window like a drive-in movie screen. Officers moved with the purposeful urgency of an active investigation, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness to illuminate areas that remained hidden from my perspective. Whatever they were investigating, it was serious enough to close the entire facility and serious enough to have been mentioned in a radio broadcast that seemed to originate from tomorrow morning. The radio spoke again as I passed mile marker 21, but this time the voice carried an undercurrent of static that made the words harder to distinguish. KTWR reminds drivers to stay alert during overnight hours. Fatigue-related incidents increase significantly between 3 and 5 a.m., particularly during adverse weather conditions. Remember, your destination is always just one safe mile at a time. That final message sounded almost normal, like standard public safety advice that any radio station might broadcast during dangerous driving conditions. But the timing felt deliberate, as if the announcer knew exactly when I would pass the rest area and wanted to offer some kind of guidance or warning. The static increased until the voice disappeared entirely, leaving me alone with the sound of snow hitting my windshield and the steady rhythm of wipers fighting a losing battle against the accumulating precipitation. I drove through the remainder of the night in a state of heightened awareness, checking my mirrors obsessively and monitoring my speed with paranoid precision. The storm gradually weakened as dawn approached, exactly as the radio had predicted, until the first pale rays of sunlight revealed a landscape transformed by several inches of unexpected snow. The official weather services began issuing alerts around 7 a.m., hours after the storm had already moved through the region. The Midnight Duet, from Jake Morrison. The thing about driving long haul for 15 years is you learn to distinguish every sound your rig makes, every vibration that travels through the cab, every whisper of metal and rubber against asphalt. My Kenworth and I, we speak the same language, understand each other's moods and needs. So when I first heard that horn crying out in the Montana darkness, I knew immediately it wasn't mine. It was past 2 in the morning, and I was hauling a load of electronics from Seattle to Chicago, making good time through the endless stretch of highway. The radio had given up its signal about 50 miles back, leaving me with nothing but the steady thrum of the diesel engine and the occasional crackle of distant CB chatter. Rain had started falling an hour ago, not the heavy drops that demand your full attention, but that fine, persistent mist that makes everything look soft and uncertain under the headlight beams. The first time I heard it, I thought maybe it was an echo of my own horn bouncing off some hill or overpass. Though I couldn't remember touching the cord, it was a long, mournful wail that seemed to stretch across the empty prairie, rising and falling like something in pain. I checked my mirrors, but the highway behind me was black as tar, not even a distant glow of approaching headlights to explain the sound. I keyed the CB, switching through channels, listening for any chatter that might explain what I'd heard. Nothing but static and the occasional burst of Spanish from some distant trucker, probably hundreds of miles south. The sound came again, clearer this time, definitely a truck horn, but with a quality I'd never heard before, almost like it was screaming. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the cab despite my windows being rolled tight against the rain. The Montana landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills disappearing into black void, fence posts and telephone poles standing like silent sentinels beside the road. Every few miles, a ranch gate or mailbox would sweep past in my headlight beam, brief flashes of human presence in all that emptiness. But no other vehicles, no explanation for that haunting sound. The horn wailed again, and this time I felt it in my chest, a vibration that seemed to resonate with something deep inside the cab. My own horn cord swayed gently from its position near my left shoulder, untouched, innocent. I reached up and gave it a quick pull, and my familiar air horn responded with its usual authoritative blast, completely different from the otherworldly cry I'd been hearing. Where mine was sharp and purposeful, this other sound was raw, desperate, like something trying to warn the world of approaching doom. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the next occurrence, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the mirrors showing nothing but empty darkness behind me. The rain intensified slightly, creating patterns of light and shadow on the windshield that my wipers couldn't quite keep up with. In those brief moments between wiper passes, when the world became distorted through water droplets, I thought I saw shapes moving in the distance, but they always resolved into nothing more than the natural contours of the landscape. Then I saw the truck. It appeared gradually, like something emerging from deep water. First just a suggestion of bulk beside the highway, then more defined as my headlights found it. An old Peterbilt, probably from the 70s, sitting in the gravel lot of what might have once been a truck stop. The building beside it was dark, maybe abandoned, its windows reflecting my passing lights like empty eyes. But the truck itself seemed somehow present, alive, despite showing no lights of its own. As I drew closer, I could make out more details. The Peterbilt was painted in faded blues and whites, its chrome dulled by years of weather and road salt. It sat at an odd angle, nose pointed toward the highway, as if its driver had been preparing to merge into traffic, but had stopped at the last moment. There was something unsettling about its position, something that made me ease off the throttle, despite having no logical reason to slow down. The horn sounded again just as I was passing the truck stop, so loud and close that I instinctively ducked, expecting to see headlights bearing down on me. But the highway remained empty, and in my mirror I watched the old Peterbilt fade back into darkness. The sound lingered in the air much longer than any normal horn blast should, echoing across the prairie like the voice of something ancient and forgotten. Breaker 19, this is Midnight Express eastbound on Highway 2. Anybody else hearing that horn out here? Static answered me, then a faint voice, so distant it might have been imagination. That old Pete's been calling out for 20 years now, the voice said, barely audible through the interference. Nobody knows why it won't stay quiet. It keyed the mic again. Come back on that, good buddy. You're real weak and fading. Nothing but static. I tried several more times, switching channels, adjusting the squelch, but whoever had spoken was gone, if they'd ever been there at all. The rain was coming harder now, forcing me to slow down as visibility decreased. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, and beyond their reach, the world had ceased to exist. The horn came again, closer somehow, and I realized with growing unease that it seemed to be following me. Each time it sounded, it felt nearer, more urgent, as if something was trying desperately to get my attention. I found myself checking my mirrors obsessively, but the highway behind remained empty, just wet asphalt disappearing into black nothingness. I tried to focus on the familiar routine of driving, checking my gauges, monitoring the CB, calculating fuel stops and arrival times, but the normalcy felt forced, artificial. Every few minutes that terrible horn would split the night, and each time it did, my truck seemed to shudder slightly, as if responding to some invisible presence. They appeared suddenly, much closer than they should have been, filling my mirrors with brilliant white light. I hadn't seen them approaching, hadn't noticed the gradual glow that usually announces another vehicle's presence. They were just there, bearing down on me fast, too fast for the wet condition. The horn sounded again, directly behind me now, so loud it seemed to shake rain from my windshield. But these weren't the headlights of the old Peterbilt I'd passed. These were different, higher, more modern. I accelerated, my diesel engine responding with a surge of power, but the lights stayed with me, matching my speed exactly. I tried my CB again. Breaker, got somebody running right up on my back door here, you might want to back it down a little. No response from the vehicle behind me, just those relentless headlights growing larger in my mirrors. The horn blasted again, not the mournful cry I'd been hearing all night, but my own horn, controlled by my own hand on the cord, though I had no memory of pulling it. That's when I understood. The realization hit me like cold water, making my hands shake on the steering wheel. I wasn't hearing some phantom horn crying out in the darkness. I was hearing my own horn, but not now, not tonight. I was hearing it from some other time, some other version of this drive, echoing across years or dimensions or whatever thin barrier separates one moment from another. The truck behind me was gaining ground, its headlights now so bright they washed out my mirrors completely. I could hear its engine, a deep rumble that seemed familiar. And when its horn sounded again, I realized it was the same mournful wail I'd been hearing all night, close enough now to rattle my windows. I floored the accelerator, my Kenworth responding with everything it had. But the pursuing truck matched me effortlessly. The speedometer climbed past safe limits for the wet roads, but I couldn't seem to create any distance. In my mirrors I caught glimpses of the other vehicle's profile, and what I saw made my blood freeze. It was my own truck. Same model Kenworth, same color scheme, same configuration, but older somehow, weathered, like something that had been driving these roads for decades without rest. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I could barely make out the silhouette of a driver, someone who sat with my posture, held the wheel with my grip. I turned to look directly at it, but the rain and darkness made details impossible to discern. All I could see was a shadow behind the wheel, a figure that might have been my reflection, if reflections could exist independently of mirror. The other driver turned toward me, and though I couldn't make out features, I felt the weight of recognition. The Laughing Pistons. From Marcus Chan. The first time I heard my Peterbilt's engine laugh, I thought it was just the diesel particulate filter acting up again. You know how these newer rigs sound when the emissions system gets cranky? All those weird whistles and mechanical hiccups that make you wonder if you should pull over and call roadside assistance. But this wasn't like that. This was something else entirely, something that made the hair on my arms stand up even though the cab was warm and the heater was humming its familiar tune. I was hauling a load of electronics from Portland to Denver, taking the scenic route through eastern Oregon because I had time to kill and the main highways were backed up with construction. The autumn rain had been falling steadily for 3 hours, creating that hypnotic rhythm on the windshield that usually helps me stay focused during long hauls. My wipers were keeping time like a metronome, and the yellow glow from my dashboard instruments painted everything in soft amber light. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, but mostly it was just me and the road stretching out ahead into the darkness. At first it sounded like a mechanical chuckle buried deep in the engine compartment, almost lost beneath the steady rumble of the 6-cylinder Cummins. I turned down the radio and listened more carefully, pressing my ear toward the driver's side window. The sound came again, a low, breathy laugh that seemed to rise and fall with the engine's RPMs. When I accelerated up a particularly steep grade, the laughter grew louder, more pronounced, as if whatever was causing it was feeding off the increased power demand. I pulled into a truck stop near Bend to check under the hood, thinking maybe a loose belt or a failing bearing was creating some kind of resonance in the engine bay. The rain had intensified, drumming against the metal surfaces of my rig with insistent fingers. I popped the hood and grabbed my flashlight, illuminating the familiar landscape of hoses, belts, and mechanical components that I'd been working with for 15 years. Everything looked normal. The engine oil was clean, the coolant levels were fine, and all the belts were properly tensioned. I even checked the air intake system, thinking maybe some debris had gotten lodged in there and was creating the strange sound. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the entire engine block had developed a sense of humor about something I couldn't understand. The other drivers at the truck stop were busy with their own concerns, fueling up and checking their loads, and none of them seemed to notice anything unusual about my rig. I asked the mechanic on duty if he'd ever heard anything like it, but he just shrugged and suggested I get the engine computer scanned at the next major service center. Back on the road, the laughter continued, sometimes soft and barely audible, other times rising to an almost conversational volume that made me glance at the passenger seat to see if someone had somehow climbed into the cab without me noticing. The rain kept falling, creating a curtain of water that my headlights struggled to penetrate. I found myself adjusting my driving to match the rhythm of the laughter, unconsciously timing my gear shifts and throttle inputs to synchronize with whatever was amusing my engine so much. The CB radio started acting strange around 2 in the morning. Instead of the usual trucker chatter, I began picking up what sounded like old radio shows, the kind of comedy programs my grandfather used to listen to from the night. Canned laughter mixed with the mechanical chuckling from under my hood, creating an odd stereo effect that made the cab feel like it was filled with invisible passengers enjoying some private joke. I tried switching channels, but every frequency seemed to be broadcasting the same vintage entertainment, complete with crackling sound quality and advertisements for products that hadn't existed for decades. As I descended into the high desert country of Central Oregon, the landscape outside became increasingly surreal in my headlights. The rain had stopped, but a thick fog had rolled in, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet in any direction. My engine's laughter grew more animated, sometimes breaking into what I could only describe as mechanical giggles when I hit certain RPM ranges. The sound was becoming oddly comforting in a way that probably should have worried me more than it did. Instead of feeling unsettled, I found myself smiling along with whatever entity had taken up residence in my engine bay. They appeared suddenly in my mirrors, a convoy of rigs that I hadn't seen approach despite the straight, level highway stretching for miles behind me. Their headlights cut through the fog in perfect formation, maintaining exactly the same following distance as if they were being controlled by a single mind. I tried raising them on the CB, but all I got was more of that vintage radio programming, now mixed with what sounded like a live studio audience applauding something I couldn't see. The lead truck in the convoy behind me was an old Freightliner, the kind of classic long-nose rig that you don't see much anymore except at truck shows and in the collections of dedicated, and even through the fog and darkness I could tell it was in pristine condition, its chrome bumper and exhaust stacks gleaming like they'd been polished to mirror brightness. The driver was just a shadow behind the windshield, but I could somehow sense that he was smiling, sharing in whatever joke had infected my own engine. Spread out in the valley below was a truck stop that definitely hadn't been there when I'd driven this route 6 months earlier. Neon signs advertised fuel prices that were at least 20 years out of date, and the architectural style of the buildings looked like something from the... Dozens of classic rigs were parked in neat rows, their chrome and paint schemes representing decades of trucking history. Every single one of their engines was running, and even from a distance I could hear the collective sound of mechanical laughter rising into the night air. The convoy behind me began signaling for the exit, their turn signals blinking in perfect unison. My own engine's laughter grew so loud that it seemed to be coming from the steering wheel, the gear shifter, even the seat cushions beneath me. The CB radio crackled with an announcement in the style of an old-time radio host, welcoming drivers to what he called the Laughing Engine Motor Lodge, where every mile was a smile and every engine got the joke. The voice had that tinny, compressed quality of audio equipment from a bygone era, but underneath it I could hear the unmistakable sound of genuine mechanical amusement. I could follow the convoy down the exit ramp toward the impossible truck stop, or I could keep driving straight ahead into the fog and whatever waited beyond. My engine made the decision for me, the throttle responding sluggishly when I tried to maintain speed, the transmission downshifting of its own accord as if it had already decided we were taking the exit. The laughter grew warmer somehow, more welcoming, like an old friend inviting me to join a party that had been going on for decades. They all looked normal enough, just working truckers like myself, but there was something timeless about them, as if they came from different eras of the industry but had somehow found themselves traveling the same highway at the same time. Some wore the kind of trucker caps and flannel shirts that were popular in the 1970s, while others sported the high-tech gear favored by today's drivers. All of them were smiling, and their engines were all laughing in harmonious mechanical chorus. The fuel island at the truck stop was staffed by an attendant in a crisp uniform that looked like it belonged in a 1950s service station advertisement. He waved me toward an open pump with the kind of enthusiastic customer service that had disappeared from most truck stops decades ago. My engine settled into a contented idle that sounded remarkably like mechanical purring, mixed with occasional chuckles. The attendant began filling my tanks without being asked, whistling a tune that seemed to complement the engine's laughter perfectly. I climbed down from the cab to stretch my legs and get a closer look at the other trucks. Each one was a masterpiece of automotive history, from early Peterbilts and Kenworths to Max and Freightliners, spanning 7 decades of over-the-road trucking. Their engines hummed with the same amused contentment as my own rig, creating a symphony of happy machinery that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The drivers were gathered around picnic tables near the main building, sharing stories and coffee, their faces lit by the warm glow of vintage neon signs advertising. The map beneath, from Marcus Delacroix. The thing about driving long haul is that your body becomes part of the machine after enough years on the road. 23 years I've been pulling freight across this continent, and my hands know every vibration in the steering wheel, every subtle shift in the diesel's rhythm, every whisper of wind against the cab. My 2019 Peterbilt 579 has been my partner for the last 4 years, her chrome gleaming under truck stop lights, her deep blue paint job still pristine despite countless miles of highway wear. We understand each other, this rig and I, which is why I noticed something was wrong the moment I climbed into the cab that October evening in Billings, Montana. The dispatch had been routine enough, a refrigerated load bound for Portland, Oregon, nothing I hadn't hauled a dozen times before. The weight was good, the paperwork clean, and the weather forecast promised clear skies for the mountain pass. But as I settled into my worn leather seat and reached for the ignition. Something made me pause. The cab felt different somehow, charged with an energy that raised the fine hairs on my forearms. The familiar scent of diesel and old coffee was there, but underneath it lingered something else, something that reminded me of copper pennies and rain-soaked earth. I shook off the unease and fired up the engine, listening to her familiar rumble as the gauges came to life. The load needed to be in Portland by Thursday morning, which gave me plenty of time to make the run without pushing too hard. I prefer the night driving anyway, fewer four-wheelers cluttering up the interstate, just the steady hypnotic rhythm of yellow lines disappearing under my bumper. The moon was nearly full that night, casting everything in silver light as I rolled out of the truck stop and onto I-9. For the first 100 miles everything felt normal. The engine purred at a steady 65, the trailer tracked true behind me, and the CB chattered with the usual mix of traffic reports and driver banter. But as I approached the turn south toward I-90, I started noticing an odd sensation in my right forearm, a gentle tingling that felt almost like the truck was trying to communicate with me through the steering wheel. I flexed my fingers and adjusted my grip, thinking it was just the beginning of fatigue, but the sensation persisted, growing stronger as the miles rolled by. Somewhere past Livingston, Montana, as the highway began its long climb toward the Continental Divide, the tingling evolved into something more defined. It felt as though someone was drawing on my skin with the tip of a feather, tracing delicate lines from my wrist to my elbow. The sensation was so real that I actually looked down at my arm in the green glow of the dashboard lights, half expecting to see marks there, but my skin appeared normal, just the familiar landscape of old scars and sunspots that come with decades of outdoor work. Then I saw the first road sign that made my blood run cold. In my headlights, a green reflective sign read, "De la Croix Creek, 3 miles," with an arrow pointing toward a dark exit ramp I was certain hadn't existed moments before. Delacroix is my surname, a name I'd never encountered anywhere in Montana, despite years of travel through the state. The coincidence was impossible, yet there was the sign, as real and solid as the steering wheel in my hand. The phantom fingers had reached my shoulder now, tracing what felt like a complex interchange, complete with on-ramps and overpasses, and I realized with growing horror that they were mapping my route in real time. Every turn of the highway ahead seemed to appear first on my skin, drawn by invisible hands that knew the road better than any GPS system ever could. The truck continued forward as though guided by something beyond my control, following a path that existed first on my body before materializing in the physical world. I tried to stop, to pull over and make sense of what was happening, but my hands wouldn't respond properly to my brain's commands. They held the steering wheel steady, maintaining speed and course as the invisible cartographer continued their work. The map had spread across my chest now, a network of highways and byways that seemed to encompass an entire continent, roads that connected places I'd been and destinations I'd never heard of, all drawn in sensation so vivid I could feel the texture of each line. The darkness outside began to change, growing thicker somehow, more absolute. Even my headlights seemed to penetrate only a few feet ahead, as though the very air was becoming solid. The engine's rhythm remained steady, but I could hear new sounds now, whispers that might have been wind through the trees, or voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The CB radio crackled to life briefly, broadcasting what sounded like coordinates in a voice identical to my own, before falling silent again. That's when I understood that the map being drawn on my skin wasn't showing me where I was going, but rather where I'd been, every route I'd ever driven being traced and recorded by fingers that felt ancient and known. 23 years of highways were being cataloged on my body, from the first nervous runs as a rookie driver to the confident cross-country hauls of recent years. But there were other roads too, paths I'd never traveled being drawn with the same careful precision, routes through territories that existed only in shadow and possibility. The Delacroix Creek exit was approaching fast, its off-ramp disappearing into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow light itself. The invisible hands were working frantically now, covering my back and arms with a network of roads, So intricate it felt like having a living atlas embedded in my skin. Each line burned with cold fire, marking not just geography but something deeper. Something that connected the landscape to the very essence of who I was as a driver. As the truck began to slow for the exit against my will, I caught a glimpse in my side mirror of something that shouldn't have been. The trailer I was pulling was gone, replaced by a much older rig. Something from the 1940s or 50s. Its chrome dulled with age and its paint faded to the color of old bone. But more disturbing was the driver visible in the cab's rear window, a figure that looked exactly like me but wearing clothes from decades past. His face bearing the same weathered features but the frequency of solitude. From Marcus Webb, the Kensington Bridge has been my regular crossing for almost 15 years now, stretching across the Blackwater Gorge like a steel spine connecting two worlds. During daylight hours, it carries the steady stream of commuter traffic and freight haulers, like myself, the rumble of tires on metal grating, creating that familiar industrial symphony. But tonight, as I guide my Peterbilt 379 through the thick mountain fog at 2:30 in the morning, I'm discovering something about this bridge I never knew existed. The discovery began 3 hours ago when I departed the lumber mill outside Millbrook, my trailer loaded with fresh-cut pine, destined for a construction site 200 miles south. The route takes me through some of the most isolated stretches of highway in the region, winding mountain roads where cell towers are sparse, and the only company comes from the occasional pair of headlights cutting through the darkness. I've grown comfortable with the solitude over the years, finding peace in the steady drone of my diesel engine and the gentle sway of the cab as we navigate the curves. The fog rolled in somewhere around Deer Creek, starting as wisps that danced in my headlight beams before thickening into a dense wall that reduced visibility to maybe 30 yards. I downshifted and reduced speed, letting the engine's compression help control our descent toward the valley floor, where the Kensington Bridge waits. The familiar landmarks disappeared one by one into the gray void, leaving only the yellow center line and the occasional reflective marker to guide my way. The usual ambient sounds of the night, the distant hum of traffic on parallel routes, the occasional bark of a coyote, all seemed muffled by more than just the fog. There was a quality to the silence that felt almost expectant, like the pause before a symphony began. My CB radio, normally crackling with the chatter of other night haulers, had gone completely quiet. Even the static seemed subdued, as if the airwaves themselves were holding their breath. The bridge entrance materialized out of the fog like a threshold between realms, its steel framework disappearing into the gray above. The weight sensors detected my approach and the traffic lights cycled to green, though I couldn't recall ever seeing it red during my previous crossing. Perhaps it was automated for safety during these low visibility conditions. I eased onto the metal grating, feeling that familiar vibration, as 40 tons of truck and cargo settled onto the bridge deck. That's when I first heard it. There was a tone, a sustained note that seemed to harmonize with the diesel's rumble. I checked my gauges, all normal. Oil pressure steady, coolant temperature in the green, turbo boost reading nominal. But the tone persisted, growing more distinct as I reached the bridge's center span. It wasn't coming from my truck at all. It was coming from the bridge itself. The sound was unlike anything I'd encountered in my years on the road. Imagine the lowest note of a massive pipe organ, felt more than heard, resonating through the steel superstructure and into my bones. But beneath that fundamental tone were harmonics, overtones that created an almost musical quality. The bridge was humming, actually humming, like some enormous tuning fork struck by an invisible hand. I brought the truck to a stop in the exact center of the span, engaging the parking brake and letting the engine idle down to its lowest setting. The humming became more pronounced, more complex. There were layers to it now, multiple frequencies weaving together in patterns that seemed almost intentional. Not random vibrations from wind or thermal expansion, but something that suggested purpose, even intelligence. The fog seemed to respond to the sound, swirling in slow spirals around my cab. Through the passenger side window, I could barely make out the bridge's suspension cables disappearing into the gray above, but they appeared to be moving, swaying gently in rhythm with the humming. There was no wind that I could feel, no reason for such movement, yet the massive steel cables danced like harp strings being plucked by invisible fingers. As soon as my fingers touched the plastic handle, the humming changed, dropping in pitch and taking on an almost questioning quality. I released the microphone and the tone returned to its previous frequency. When I touched it again, the same shift occurred, as if the bridge was responding to my intentions, aware of my presence, and somehow listening to my thought. Ice crystals were forming on the inside of my windows, creating fractal patterns that seemed to pulse in time with the bridge's song. Through these icy formations, the fog outside took on shapes that my mind struggled to interpret. Faces, perhaps, or architectural forms from some impossible geometry. The longer I stared, the more defined these shapes became, as if the act of observation was bringing them into existence. The digits seemed sluggish, changing at intervals that felt too long. Time itself appeared to be stretching, each second lasting an eternity, while the bridge continued its otherworldly performance. I tried to count along with the seconds, but found my perception of duration becoming unreliable. How long had I been stopped here? Minutes, hours, not words in any language I recognized, but the cadence and inflection of conversation, as if multiple speakers were engaged in some urgent discussion, just beyond the range of my understanding. The voices seemed to be coming from different directions, some from above in the bridge's towers, others from below in the gorge, and still others from positions that defied spatial logic. I pressed my face to the driver's side window, trying to peer down into the Blackwater Gorge through the fog. What I saw made my blood freeze. The darkness below wasn't empty. There were lights down there, not the warm yellow of human habitation, but cold blue-white points that arranged themselves in geometric patterns. These lights pulsed in synchronization with the bridge's humming, as if they were visual manifestations of the same phenomena. The patterns they formed were complex, mathematical, suggesting some form of communication or ritual that predated human understanding. The realization hit me then, with a clarity that cut through my confusion like a blade. This bridge wasn't simply a crossing over the gorge. It was a conduit, a resonating chamber that connected our world to somewhere else. The humming wasn't random. It was a signal, a beacon that activated only in the deep hours of night when traffic was sparse and the electromagnetic interference from human activity was at its minimum. When it was truly alone, the bridge could fulfill its real purpose. The suspension creaked and the trailer swayed gently from side to side, creating small waves in the fog that rippled outward in perfect circles. Whatever existed in the space beneath the bridge was aware of my presence, and was perhaps beginning to take an interest in this unexpected visitor to its domain. The voices in the bridge's song became more agitated, their alien conversation rising in both volume and urgency. The ice patterns on my windows grew more elaborate, forming symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they were information compressed into visual form that my human mind wasn't equipped to process. I felt a pressure building in my skull, not painful but profoundly uncomfortable, like the sensation of ascending too quickly in an aircraft. I knew I had to leave. Every instinct screamed that my continued presence here was drawing attention I didn't want and might not survive. But when I reached for the gear selector, my hand passed through it as if it were made of mist. I tried again, focusing all my concentration on the simple act of grasping the lever, and this time felt solid plastic beneath my finger. The boundary between realities was becoming permeable, and I was caught in the transition zone. The bridge's humming rose to an almost unbearable intensity, the harmonics creating interference patterns in my vision that made the road ahead appear to ripple like water. The fog began to take on a luminescent quality, glowing with that same cold blue-white light I'd seen in the gorge below. Within this illuminated mist, shapes moved with purpose and intelligence, keeping pace with my truck as I crawled toward the bridge's far end. The exit came into view gradually, the familiar green highway markers materializing out of the luminous fog, like old friends welcoming me back to the mundane world. As my front wheels touched solid asphalt again, the humming began to fade, the bridge's song diminishing note by note, until only the normal sounds of night remained. The fog thinned rapidly, as if it had served its purpose and was no longer needed. Behind me, the Kensington Bridge returned to its daytime appearance, the static between sleep and waking. From Jake Morrison. I've been hauling freight across the interstate for 17 years, and in all that time I never believed in anything I couldn't see, smell, or kick with my steel-toed boots. My Peterbilt 37.9 and I had covered more miles than most folks see in a lifetime. From the rain-soaked highways of Oregon to the sun-baked stretches of Arizona desert, the CB radio mounted above my dashboard had been my constant companion through lonely nights and endless miles, crackling with the familiar voices of other drivers, sharing road conditions, weather reports, and the occasional tall tale to pass the time. It was during a late September run from Denver to Omaha that I first encountered the voice that would change everything I thought I knew about the world beyond my windshield. The autumn air carried a crisp bite that fogged the glass, and I had to run the defroster constantly as I navigated through the rolling hills of eastern Colorado. My load of industrial machinery sat heavy behind me, the trailer wheels singing their familiar song against wet asphalt as a light drizzle painted streaks across my mirrors. The CB had been unusually quiet that night, with only the occasional check-in from other drivers fighting the same weather I was. Static filled the spaces between transmissions, rising and falling like electronic breathing in the darkness of my cab. The dashboard lights cast everything in a soft amber glow, and the steady rhythm of my windshield wipers created a hypnotic cadence that made the miles blur together. I was somewhere near Sterling, Colorado, when the transmission came through, cutting through the static with a clarity that made me sit up straighter in my seat. The voice was gentle, almost whisper-soft, belonging to someone who spoke with the careful precision of someone choosing each word, deliberately. Westbound Peterbilt passing mile marker 107, the voice said, and I glanced at my GPS to see I was approaching that exact marker. You're thinking about your daughter again, the one who stopped calling after the divorce. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the September air seeping through my window. I grabbed the CB handset, my thumb hovering over the transmit button, but something held me back. The voice continued, calm and matter-of-fact, as if discussing nothing more unusual than road conditions or fuel prices. Always the same dream. She's 7 years old again, sitting in your lap while you show her how the gears work, before everything went wrong, before the drinking and the fights, and the way she looked at you that last Christmas like you were a stranger. I finally found my voice and keyed the microphone. Who is this? How do you know about my daughter? The static swallowed my words, and for a long moment there was only the sound of rain against glass and the steady rumble of my engine. Then the voice returned, unchanged by my challenge, as if the speaker hadn't heard my transmission at all. The guilt follows you into sleep, doesn't it? You can feel it settling over you like a heavy blanket every time you close your eyes. It's why you drive longer shifts than you should, why you drink 3 cups of coffee past midnight, why you volunteered for this overnight run when you could have been home in your empty apartment. I tried the CB again, cycling through channels, but the voice seemed to follow me wherever I tuned. Other drivers were talking about construction delays near Grand Island and a speed trap east of North Platte, but underneath their familiar chatter, I could hear that soft, knowing voice continuing its impossible commentary on the contents of my sleeping mind. In the dream, she asks you why you left, and you never have a good answer. You try to explain about the job, about the miles you have to cover to make a living, but she's 7 years old, and she doesn't understand why daddy's work is more important than tucking her in at night. You wake up every time just as she starts to cry. The rain was getting heavier, forcing me to slow down as visibility dropped to maybe 50 yards ahead of my headlight. I could see the glow of truck stop signs in the distance, islands of neon warmth in the darkness, but something kept me from pulling over. I needed to understand what was happening, Needed to know who was speaking words that cut straight through 17 years of carefully constructed emotional armor. Channel 19. This is Jake Morrison in the blue Peterbilt. I need to know who's been talking about dreams and personal matters. Please respond. The CB crackled with responses from drivers who'd been monitoring the channel, asking what I was talking about, saying they'd only heard traffic and weather reports for the past hour. But I could still hear that other voice, weaving between their transmissions like smoke, growing clearer as the miles rolled past. You carry her picture in your wallet, but you haven't looked at it in months because it hurts too much. She's 16 now, learning to drive, probably dating, making all the mistakes you want to protect her from, but can't because you chose the road over being her father. The shame of it sits in your chest like a stone, getting heavier with every mile you put between yourself and the life you abandoned. I was approaching the Nebraska border now, and the landscape had flattened into endless cornfields that stretched away from the highway like a dark sea. The rain had settled into a steady downpour that hammered against my roof and made every other sound seem muffled and distant. My CB was alive with chatter about the storm, drivers warning each other about standing water and reduced visibility, but I could barely focus on their words. The voice that shouldn't exist continued its impossible broadcast, describing dreams I'd never told another living soul, fears I'd never spoken aloud, regrets that lived in the deepest corners of my mind. It spoke of nightmares about jackknifing on icy roads, of dreams where my truck broke down in the middle of nowhere and I had to call my ex-wife for help, of the recurring vision where I showed up at my daughter's graduation, only to find she'd changed her name and wanted nothing to do with me. The worst dream is the one where you're driving through a storm, just like this one, the voice said, and I felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Your CB starts picking up transmissions that shouldn't be possible, and you realize someone is watching you, someone who can see into the places you keep your deepest shame. You want to turn off the radio, but you can't, because part of you needs to hear these words, needs someone to finally acknowledge the weight you've been carrying alone for so many years. I reached for the CB's power switch, my hand shaking as the voice described exactly what I was about to do. But I couldn't bring myself to cut the connection, as terrifying as this was. The voice was right about one thing. I did need to hear these words, needed someone to finally understand the burden I carried through every mile of highway, every sleepless night in truck stop parking lots, every Christmas morning spent alone in a different state. You're wondering if you're losing your mind, the voice continued, gentle and understanding, wondering if the loneliness and the guilt and the endless miles have finally broken something important inside your head. But you can feel the truth of it, can't you? This isn't madness. This is something else entirely, something that lives in the static between sleep and waking, feeding on the dreams that leak out of tired minds, traveling dark highway. The truck stop at Big Springs appeared through my windshield like a beacon, its bright lights cutting through the rain and darkness. I could see other trucks parked in neat rows, their running lights glowing like stars, and suddenly I desperately wanted to be among other people, to hear normal conversations about normal things. But as I activated my turn signal, the voice spoke again, and this time there was something different in its tone, something that might have been hunger. There are so many more dreams to explore, so many more secrets buried in the deep places of your sleep. The dream about the accident that wasn't your fault, but feels like it was. The one where your father tells you you'll never amount to anything, just before the cancer takes him, and you never get the chance to prove him wrong. The nightmare where every road leads back to the same empty apartment, and you realize you've been driving in circles for 17 years, getting nowhere at all. Something in that voice had changed, become less comforting and more possessive, and I began to understand that whatever was speaking to me through the CB wasn't trying to help me confront my fear. It was feeding on them, drawing sustenance from the pain and loneliness that poured out of my sleeping mind, night after night in truck stops and rest areas across the country. That's right, the voice whispered, and now I could hear static building underneath the words, as if the signal was getting stronger. You're beginning to understand. We've been waiting for someone like you. The Tires That Cry. From Marcus de la Croix. The first time I heard them weeping, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks through the wheel wells of my Peterbilt. 23 years I'd been hauling freight across these endless highways, and I'd learned to distinguish every sound my rig could make. The diesel's throaty rumble, the air brake's sharp hiss, the subtle whine of bearings under load. But this sound was different, rising from somewhere beneath me like a chorus of voices caught in eternal sorrow. It was a Tuesday night in late October when I first noticed it, somewhere between Tulsa and Little Rock on Interstate. The autumn rain had been falling steadily for hours, creating that hypnotic rhythm on my windshield that usually helped pass the miles. My wipers swept back and forth in their mechanical dance, and the yellow lines blurred past in the darkness beyond my headlight beam. I was making good time with a load of automotive parts bound for Memphis, the kind of routine run that paid the bills and kept my mind occupied with the simple mathematics of miles per gallon and hours of service. The crying started so softly that I almost missed it beneath the steady drone of rain and engine noise. At first it sounded like nothing more than air escaping from somewhere in my brake system, that familiar wheeze that every trucker learns to monitor. But as the miles rolled by, the sound grew more distinct, more unmistakably human in its cadence. It rose and fell like breathing, punctuated by what I could only describe as sobs. It seemed to be coming from directly beneath my cab, somewhere in the vicinity of my front axle. I tapped the brake pedal gently, testing my air pressure, but the gauges showed normal reading. The sound continued, unaffected by my speed or gear changes, maintaining its steady rhythm of lamentation that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. At the next truck stop, a brightly lit oasis of fluorescent tubes and diesel pumps called the Roadrunner Plaza, I pulled in for what I told myself was a routine inspection. The place was nearly deserted at this hour, with only a handful of other rigs scattered across the vast parking lot, like sleeping giants. The rain had intensified, drumming against my cab roof with increasing urgency as I climbed down to examine my tire. Walking around the front of my truck with a flashlight, I inspected each tire carefully, looking for signs of damage or unusual wear. The Michelins were relatively new, with plenty of tread remaining, and showed no obvious signs of distress. But as I knelt beside the passenger side steer tire, running my hand along its rain-slicked surface, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The tire was warm to the touch, not from road friction or brake heat, but with the kind of warmth that radiates from living flesh. I jerked my hand back instinctively, then forced myself to touch the tire again. The warmth was unmistakable, pulsing gently like a heartbeat beneath the black rubber. As I crouched there in the rain, my flashlight beam dancing across the tire's surface, I could hear the crying more clearly than ever. It wasn't coming from the tire itself, but from somewhere within it, as if the rubber had become a membrane containing something alive and suffering. The logical part of my mind searched for explanations. Perhaps there was a bearing problem I hadn't detected, generating unusual heat. Maybe the sound was nothing more than trapped air or moisture interacting with the tire's internal structure in some way I didn't understand. But as I stood there in the rain, listening to what sounded increasingly like human voices, raised in anguish, logic felt as distant as the stars hidden behind the storm clouds. I climbed back into my cab, toweling off the rain and trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me, like a cold blanket. The truck stop's neon signs flickered through my windshield, casting alternating patterns of red and blue across my dashboard. I considered calling my dispatcher, perhaps arranging for a maintenance check at our next terminal. But what would I tell them? That my tires were crying? That they felt warm like living skin? They'd order me to take a mandatory rest period and schedule me for a fitness for duty evaluation. Instead, I pulled back onto the interstate, hoping that whatever I was experiencing would fade with the miles. But as I accelerated up the on-ramp, the crying grew louder, more insistent. What had been barely audible whispers of sorrow now rose to a keening wail, that seemed to penetrate every surface of my cab. I tried turning up my radio, but the voices beneath me grew louder still, as if responding to my attempts to drown them out. The miles passed in a blur of rain and growing dread. With each rotation of my wheels, the crying intensified, and I began to distinguish individual voices within the chorus. There was a woman's voice, high and desperate, calling out what sounded like a name I couldn't quite make out. A child's voice, thin and frightened, repeating the same phrase over and over. An old man's voice, raw with grief, speaking in a language I didn't recognize, but whose meaning was unmistakably one of loss and longing. By the time I reached the outskirts of Little Rock, the voices had become so loud that I could barely concentrate on driving. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I fought to maintain my position in the right lane, watching other vehicles pass me in the night, while their drivers remained blissfully unaware of the supernatural symphony emanating from beneath my cab. I considered pulling over again, but something deep in my gut warned me against stopping on the side of the highway. Whatever was happening to my truck, I sensed that isolation would only make it worse. As I navigated the interchange toward Interstate 30, the nature of the crying began to change. The individual voices started to merge into a single, overwhelming chorus of anguish that rose and fell like a tide of despair. The sound no longer seemed to be coming from my tires alone, but from the road itself, as if every mile of asphalt beneath me was saturated with the tears of countless souls. At first they appeared to be normal commercial vehicles like my own, maintaining steady speeds in the right-hand lanes. But as I passed them, or they passed me, I caught glimpses of their drivers' faces in the green glow of their dashboard lights. Every face wore the same expression of barely controlled terror, the same wide-eyed recognition of something fundamentally wrong with their machines. And from each of their trucks I could hear the faint echo of crying, the same mournful chorus that rose from my own wheel. A voice crackled over my CB radio, Channel 19, cutting through the static with desperate urgency. Eastbound Peterbilt at mile marker 47, you copy? The voice was strained on the edge of panic. This is the blue Kenworth behind you. Tell me you hear it too. Tell me I'm not losing my mind out here. I grabbed my microphone with shaking hands. I copy, blue Kenworth. I hear it. The crying. It's coming from the tires, isn't it? God help us, yes. The relief in his voice was palpable. Started about 50 miles back. Thought I was having some kind of breakdown. How many of us are there? Over the next few minutes, more voices joined our conversation. A dozen drivers all heading east on this stretch of Arkansas highway, all experiencing the same phenomena. Our trucks had become vessels for something beyond understanding, carrying passengers we couldn't see but whose presence we felt with every mile. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with pale gray light, the crying began to fade. The voices grew distant, as if retreating to whatever realm they had emerged from. By the time I reached my delivery point in Memphis, the sound had diminished to barely audible whispers, and my tires felt normal beneath my touch when I performed my post-trip inspection. I never spoke to my dispatcher about what happened that night, and I never heard from any of the other drivers who shared that terrifying journey. But sometimes, on long hauls through certain stretches of highway, especially on rainy nights when the world feels thin and permeable, I still hear them. The voices of those who never reached their destinations, whose final moments were spent on these endless roads we travel. They ride with us now, their sorrow embedded in the very rubber that carries us forward, weeping for journeys that will never end and homes they'll never see again. And I've learned to listen, because someone should bear witness to their grief, even if I'll never understand why my truck and I became their chosen vessel for crossing between worlds. The Devil's Fuel, from Marcus Webb. The diesel gauge had been dancing near empty for the last 40 miles, and I was starting to wonder if I'd made a mistake taking this backcountry route through the Nevada desert. My Peterbilt 379's engine hummed its familiar song, but even she couldn't run on fumes forever. The CB radio crackled with distant conversations between drivers on the interstate, their voices growing fainter as I pushed deeper into the wasteland of sagebrush and endless sky. It was past midnight when I finally spotted the glow of neon cutting through the darkness ahead. A truck stop materialized from the heat shimmer like a mirage, though the desert air had turned cold hours ago. The sign read, "Last Chance Fuel," in flickering red letters, with half the bulbs either burned out or dying. Not the most reassuring name for a place, but beggars can't be choosers when you're running on empty in the middle of nowhere. I pulled my rig alongside the fuel island, the air brakes hissing as I came to a stop. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time, with rusted pumps that probably hadn't seen an update since the 70s. A small building squatted nearby, its windows glowing yellow against the darkness. Through the glass I could see shelves lined with dusty merchandise and a figure moving behind the counter. The diesel pump clicked and hummed as I began filling my tanks, the numbers on the ancient display rolling by slower than molasses. The fuel came out thick and dark, darker than diesel should be, but I figured it was just the poor lighting playing tricks on my eye. Desert truck stops weren't exactly known for their premium grade anything, and I'd seen plenty of questionable fuel in my 20 years on the road. The numbers weren't just rolling slowly, they were rolling backward occasionally, as if the machine couldn't decide how much fuel was actually flowing. The diesel itself seemed to move with an unusual viscosity, almost like crude oil, and it gave off a smell that wasn't quite right. Instead of the familiar petroleum scent, there was something else mixed in. Something organic and unpleasant, like meat left too long in the sun. He was an older man, probably in his 70s, with skin like leather and eyes that reflected the neon light in an unsettling way. His coveralls were stained with what looked like diesel, though the stains seemed to move slightly in my peripheral vision, shifting and flowing like living things. "Don't get many trucks through here this time of night," he said, his voice carrying an odd echo despite the open desert air. "Most drivers stick to the main roads. What brings you out to the Devil's Highway?" I told him about the detour, how I'd taken this route to avoid construction delays on the interstate. He nodded knowingly, as if he'd heard the story 1,000 times before. When I handed him my credit card, his fingers were cold as winter despite the warm desert night, and they left dark smudges on the plastic. "That fuel you just took on," he said, processing my payment with movements that seemed too deliberate, too practiced. "It's special stuff, refined right here on the property. Burns hotter than regular diesel, goes further too. You'll find it takes you places you never expected to go." Something in his tone made me uneasy, but I was tired and eager to get back on the road. I thanked him and climbed back into my cab, firing up the engine and pulling away from the Last Chance Fuel. In my mirrors, I watched the neon sign grow smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the darkness of the desert night. For the first 50 miles, everything seemed normal. The engine ran smoothly, perhaps even better than usual, and I made good time across the empty highway. But as I crested a long hill, I noticed something strange in my instrument panel. The fuel gauge, which should have dropped at least a quarter tank, still read completely full. Even stranger, the engine temperature was running hot, hotter than it had ever run before, though the coolant levels appeared normal. Then I started seeing the flames, but as I watched, the distortion began to take on definite shapes. Tongues of blue and orange fire that danced along the sides of my trailer. The flames weren't consuming anything, weren't burning through the metal, or creating smoke. They just flowed like liquid light, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. He pulled over at the next wide spot in the road and climbed out to investigate. The desert air was cool against my skin, but the heat radiating from my truck was intense, like standing too close to a furnace. The flames were definitely there, not just a trick of tired eyes or desert mirages. They crawled along every surface of my rig, blue at the base and shifting through orange to white at the tips, but they cast no light beyond themselves and gave off no smoke. The strangest thing was that the flames weren't random. They moved with purpose, forming patterns that almost looked like writing, like some ancient script that shifted and changed too quickly to read. The fuel tanks glowed from within, as if the diesel itself was luminous, and I could hear a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The radio display flickered between channels on its own, and occasionally I caught fragments of conversations that made no sense. The harvest is ready, and the binding holds, and another one carries the flame. Trucks were approaching from both directions, their headlights piercing the darkness like searching eyes. As they drew closer, I could see that they too were wreathed in the same ethereal flames. Drivers I couldn't quite make out behind windshields that reflected fire, instead of showing faces. The first truck pulled alongside me, a massive Kenworth that looked like it had been on the road far longer than any machine should last. The driver's window rolled down, but instead of seeing a person, I was looking into a cab filled with swirling flame. A voice emerged from the fire, hollow and echoing like wind through empty canyons. "Welcome to the Brotherhood," it said. "The fuel has chosen you, marked you as one of us. You carry the flame now, and the flame will carry you to places beyond the maps, beyond the world you knew." More trucks were arriving, forming a circle around my rig on the desert highway. Each one burned with the same cold fire, each one crewed by drivers who were no longer quite human. They spoke of endless roads that connected all possible destinations, of cargo that needed to be delivered to places that existed only in the spaces between reality. They spoke of the fuel that bound them all, the diesel that burst into flame but never consumed, that powered journeys through dimensions of highway that stretched beyond the physical world. The fuel was alive, in its way, a symbiotic organism that chose its hosts carefully. It offered power beyond imagination, the ability to drive roads that existed in the spaces between worlds, to see sights that no stationary human would ever witness. In exchange, it asked only for service, for a willingness to carry its flame to new places, to spread its influence across the infinite network of highways that connected all reality. I could drain the tanks, abandon the fuel, and return to my ordinary routes carrying ordinary cargo to ordinary destinations. Or I could accept the flame, become part of something larger, something that had been growing quietly in the shadows of the trucking world. I climbed back into my cab as the circle of burning trucks began to disperse, their drivers returning to whatever mysterious errands had brought them to this place. The fuel gauge still read full, and in the glow of my instrument panel, I could see tiny flames dancing behind the glass. My hands on the steering wheel felt warm, and when I looked closely, I could see threads of fire running along my palms like luminous veins. In my mirrors, the desert looked different now, marked with roads that hadn't been there before, glowing paths that branched off into impossible direction. The CB radio was picking up transmissions from drivers, hauling cargo to cities that didn't exist on any map, following routes that defied geography and physics alike. I should have been terrified, should have found the nearest truck stop and called for help. Instead, I felt a strange sense of homecoming, as if I was finally seeing the highway system as it really was, not the limited network of asphalt and concrete that ordinary drivers navigated, but the infinite web of possibility that connected every point in space and time. The passenger I never picked up. For Marcus, the thing about driving flatbed is you get used to checking your mirrors more than most truckers. With no walls or roof on your trailer, you need to keep an eye on your load, make sure nothing's shifting or coming loose. 37 years I've been hauling everything from steel beams to construction equipment across this country, and I've developed a habit of glancing back every few minutes, just to be sure. It's that habit that probably saved my sanity, or maybe cost me what was left of it. I was running a load of farm equipment from Des Moines to Little Rock on a Tuesday night in October, the kind of crisp autumn evening, where the air tastes like wood smoke and dying leaves, and the stars seem close enough to pluck from the sky. My rig, a burgundy Peterbilt 38-9, with a 48-foot flatbed, was loaded down with a combine harvester that took up most of the trailer. The machine was secured with enough chains and straps to hold down a small building, but I still checked it religiously. Cargo that size shifting at highway speed, can turn you into yesterday's news real quick. I was making good time on Highway 65, rolling through the gentle hills of southern Iowa, with about 6 hours left on my drive. The combine cast strange shadows in my trailer lights, all angular metal and complicated machinery that looked almost alien in the darkness. Every now and then I'd catch its silhouette in my side mirror and feel a little chill, the way you do when something familiar suddenly looks wrong. A quick glance in my passenger mirror showed what looked like someone sitting on the edge of my flatbed, legs dangling over the side, like a kid on a dock. I hit the brakes harder than I should have, feeling the weight of the combine push against its restraints as I pulled onto the shoulder. My heart was hammering as I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab, expecting to find some fool who'd somehow gotten onto my trailer at the last truck stop. I walked around the entire trailer twice, checking every inch of it, shining my light into every shadow and crevice where someone might hide. The October wind whistled through the harvester's metal framework, creating an almost musical sound that raised goosebumps on my arms. I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from an overpass or a road sign. After all, when you're staring at mirrors for hours on end, your eyes can play tricks on you. The engine settled into its familiar rhythm, that deep diesel purr that's been my lullaby for decades. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The darkness seemed thicker somehow, and the familiar weight of the combine behind me felt different, like it was carrying something extra. 20 miles down the road, I saw her again. This time there was no mistaking it. In the glow of a passing semi's headlights, I could clearly see a woman sitting on my flatbed. She was wearing what looked like a white dress or nightgown, and her long dark hair was whipping in the wind. Her head was turned away from me, looking out at the countryside rolling by. She sat perfectly still, despite the 70-mile-per-hour wind, as if she were simply enjoying an evening breeze on a front porch. I pulled over again, this time at a 24-hour truck stop that appeared like an oasis of fluorescent light in the darkness. The place was nearly empty, except for a few other rigs parked in the lot, their drivers presumably sleeping in their sleeper cabs. I walked around my trailer again, and again found nothing. The attendant inside, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, watched me through the window with the kind of expression reserved for drivers who've been on the road too long. When I described what I'd seen, she just shook her head and poured me a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Carter administration. "Honey, you're the third driver this month to tell me a story like that," she said, her voice carrying the weight of too many night shifts. All of them hauling on 65, all of them seeing passengers they never picked up. My advice? Don't look back until you reach Little Rock. But you can't just stop looking in your mirrors when you're driving truck. It goes against every instinct. Every safety rule burned into your brain. So I kept glancing back, and she was always there now. Sometimes sitting on the edge of the flatbed, sometimes standing between the combine's massive tires, sometimes just a pale shape in the corner of my vision. She never moved when I was looking directly at her, but the moment I turned my attention back to the road, she'd be somewhere else. The strangest part was how normal it began to feel. After the first few hours, I found myself almost expecting to see her there. She became part of the scenery, like the mile markers and exit signs. I even started thinking of her as my passenger, though she never acknowledged my presence or seemed aware that I existed at all. She just sat there in her white dress, hair flowing in the wind, looking out at a world that maybe only she could see. As I crossed into Arkansas, the landscape began to change. The gentle Iowa hills gave way to denser forests and deeper valleys. Fog started to roll in from the west, thick tendrils that caught in my headlight beams and made the road ahead look like it was dissolving. That's when I noticed that she was finally looking at me. In my mirror I could see her pale face turned toward the cab, toward me. Even though I couldn't make out her features clearly in the darkness, I could feel her eyes on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For the first time since I'd started seeing her, I felt genuinely afraid. This wasn't just some harmless apparition anymore. This was something that knew I was there, something that was paying attention. The fog grew thicker as I descended into a valley, and my mirrors began to show nothing but swirling white mist. I should have been relieved not to see her anymore, but instead I felt more nervous than ever. It was like losing sight of a dangerous animal. You knew it was still out there, but now you didn't know where. The combine's weight felt wrong again, heavier somehow, as if it were carrying more than farm equipment. Soft at first, barely audible over the engine noise, but growing steadily louder. Tap, 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 like fingernails on glass, coming from somewhere behind me. I tried to tell myself it was just the fog condensing on the trailer, or maybe something loose in the combine's mechanism, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too much like someone trying to get my attention. The tapping moved from the back of the trailer toward the front, following the length of the flatbed until it seemed to be coming from just behind my cab, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been, thick and expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for something to happen, though I couldn't say what. When the passenger door handle rattled, I nearly drove off the road. The door was locked, of course, but the handle kept moving up and down with increasing urgency. Something was trying to get into my cab, something that had ridden 700 miles on the back of my trailer and now wanted to join me up front. The fog pressed against my windows like curious fingers, and I realized I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The fog began to thin as I climbed out of the valley, and the door handle finally stopped moving. When I could see my mirrors clearly again, the flatbed was empty except for the combine, but now there were wet handprints on my passenger window, small and delicate, as if someone had been pressed against the glass, trying to see inside. By the time I reached Little Rock, the sun was coming up, and the whole experience felt like something from a fever dream. I delivered the combine to a construction depot on the outskirts of town, watching as a crew of workers unloaded it with a crane. Everything was normal, mundane, reassuring in its ordinariness. The trailer was empty now except for the chains and straps, ready for whatever load would take me back north. But as I was securing the chains for transport, I found something caught between two of the trailer's tie-down points. A piece of white fabric, thin and delicate, like it might have come from a dress or nightgown. It was damp with morning dew, and when I held it up to the light, I could see that it was old, maybe bed is old, with the kind of careful hand stitching that you don't see anymore. The Mile That Moves. From Jake Morrison. The thing about driving the same route for 15 years is that every mile marker becomes as familiar as the birthmarks on your own hands. Interstate 80 through Nevada was my bread and butter, hauling freight from Reno to Salt Lake City twice a week in my trusty Kenworth W900. I knew every curve, every rest stop, every billboard advertising divorce lawyers and all-you-can-eat buffets. But most of all, I knew the mile markers, those little green signs that tick off the endless ribbon of asphalt like a heartbeat across the desert. Mile marker 2047 had always been my halfway point, right where the highway crested a gentle rise and the lights of a tiny truck stop called Coyote Junction flickered in the distance. For 15 years, mile marker 2047 meant I could grab a coffee, stretch my legs, and call my wife Sarah to let her know I was making good time. It was routine, comfortable, predictable in a world where weather and traffic could throw curveballs at any moment. That's why it took me 3 trips to realize something was wrong. The first time I noticed it, I chalked it up to fatigue. It was a Tuesday night in late October, and I was running behind schedule due to construction outside Reno. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides, painted silver by a full moon that seemed to follow my rig like a curious eye. The steady hum of my diesel engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt created that familiar lullaby that had accompanied me through countless nights on the road. When I crested the rise where mile marker 2047 should have been, I glanced at the green sign flashing past in my headlights. I blinked hard, thinking the numbers had just registered wrong in my tired brain. But Coyote Junction was right there where it always was, its neon sign casting pink and blue shadows across the cracked parking lot. The distance felt exactly right, the timing perfect, but the mile marker was off by 2 digits. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead while country music played softly from speakers that had seen better decades. Martha, the night clerk who'd been working there since I started this route, looked up from her crossword puzzle with the same tired smile she'd worn for years. "Running late tonight, Jake?" she asked, already reaching for the extra-large cup she knew I'd want. "Yeah, a bit of construction back in Reno," I replied, watching her pour the coffee that would be too strong and bitter and absolutely perfect. "Say, Martha, this is still mile 2047, right?" I took the coffee and nodded, deciding not to mention what I'd seen on the mile marker. Fatigue plays tricks on the mind, and I'd been pushing hard to make up time. The hot coffee burned away the confusion, and by the time I climbed back into my cab, I'd convinced myself it had been nothing more than a tired brain misreading familiar numbers. 2 weeks later, I was running the same route on a clear Thursday night, well-rested and ahead of schedule. The desert air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant rain through my partially open window. I'd been looking forward to reaching mile marker 24/7, to that familiar comfort of knowing exactly where I was and how much road lay ahead. But when I crested the rise, the green sign read 251. This time I couldn't blame fatigue or poor lighting. My headlights illuminated the numbers clearly, and I was alert enough to read the smaller print below, indicating the next exit. Everything else was exactly as it should be. Coyote Junction sat in its usual spot. Martha's lights were on inside. Even the same faded billboard advertising Las Vegas wedding chapels stood guard over the valley. Only the mile marker had changed. I pulled over at the truck stop again, this time with a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with being behind schedule. Martha greeted me with the same familiar routine, but when I asked about the mile marker again, her expression grew puzzled. "Jake, honey, you asked me that same question 2 weeks ago. This is mile 147, same as it's always been. Are you having some kind of trouble? Maybe you should see a doctor when you get home." The concern in her voice was genuine, and it made me doubt what I'd seen with my own eyes. I bought my coffee and a pack of gum, then walked outside to look at the mile marker myself. In the sodium vapor lighting of the truck stop, I couldn't make out the numbers clearly, but I could see the green rectangle of the sign standing at the same angle, the same distance from the building, exactly where mile marker 20. Back in my cab, I wrote the date and 251 on a scrap of paper and tucked it into my logbook. Either I was losing my mind, or something impossible was happening on this stretch of desert highway. The third time sealed. November brought an early winter storm to the Nevada desert, and I was fighting crosswinds and scattered rain showers that turned the world outside into a shifting curtain of gray and silver. My windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm against the glass, and the heater hummed to keep the chill at bay. Despite the weather, I found myself looking forward to mile marker 147, with an anticipation that bordered on obsession. When I reached the familiar rise, my headlights cut through the rain to illuminate a green sign that this time the number had gone backward, and the impossibility of it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the November storm. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the texture of worn leather beneath my palms, and forced myself to breathe slowly. The truck stop was still there, Coyote Junction in all its weathered glory, but now it sat at mile 244 according to the official marker. I almost drove past without stopping, but something compelled me to pull in. The parking lot was nearly empty due to the weather, my rig and an older Peterbilt that belonged to a driver I didn't recognize. Inside, Martha looked up from her magazine with the same tired smile, water droplets from my jacket spattering the worn linoleum at my feet. "Nasty night out there," she said, already reaching for my usual cup. "Road treating you okay?" "Martha," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "what mile marker is this truck stop at?" Her hand froze on the coffee pot, and for just a moment, something flickered behind her eyes. Fear, maybe, or recognition. Then the expression was gone, replaced by that same puzzled concern she'd shown before. Mile 247, Jake. Same as always. Why do you keep asking me that? But she was lying. I could hear it in the slight tremor of her voice, see it in the way she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. She knew something was wrong with the mile marker, had probably known for longer than I'd been noticing it. How long have you worked here, Martha? I asked. Since '73, when they opened the truck stop. Told you that before. And in all that time, has anything ever changed around here? Anything unusual? She set down the coffee pot with shaking hands and looked out the window at my truck, its running lights cutting amber slashes through the rain. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Sometimes the road itself gets confused. Best thing to do is not ask too many questions and just keep driving. The coffee tasted like fear and old dream. I left exact change on the counter and walked back to my truck through rain that felt heavier than it should, each drop carrying whispers I couldn't quite understand. As I climbed into my cab, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There was another truck parked at the far edge of the lot, an ancient Mack that looked like it hadn't run in decades. Rust had eaten holes in its trailer, and weeds grew up through cracks in the asphalt around its tires. But that wasn't what terrified me. It was the CB antenna that still swayed slightly in the wind, and the faint glow of dashboard lights visible through the grime-covered windshield. I started my engine quickly and pulled back onto the highway, glancing in my mirrors until the lights of Coyote Junction disappeared behind a veil of rain. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been in that abandoned truck had been watching me, waiting for something I didn't understand. The Face That Changes. From Marcus Wheeler. The interstate stretched before me like a black ribbon under the October moon, and I'd been driving for 14 hours straight when I first saw her standing at the edge of the headlight's reach. Mile marker 2047, just outside Nowhere, Nevada, where the desert swallows sound and the night feels thick enough to swim through. My Peterbilt 379's engine hummed its familiar lullaby, diesel fumes mixing with the crisp autumn air that leaked through the window crack. I kept open to stay alert. The CB radio had gone quiet hours ago, leaving me alone with the rhythmic thrum of 18 wheels on asphalt and the occasional flutter of moths against my windshield. She stood perfectly still beside the guardrail, one pale hand raised in the universal gesture of need, her other arm wrapped around what looked like a small travel bag. Even from a distance, something about her posture struck me as odd, too rigid, like a mannequin posed by an amateur window dresser. But I've been hauling freight across this country for 22 years, and I've always been the kind of driver who stops for folks in trouble. Call it old-fashioned courtesy, or maybe just the loneliness that creeps in after too many nights on the road. But I eased off the throttle and began the long process of bringing 40 tons of steel and cargo to a controlled stop. The air brakes hissed as I pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath my tires. Through the passenger mirror, I watched her approach with measured steps, her movements strangely fluid in the red glow of my taillight. She moved like someone walking underwater, each step deliberate and oddly graceful. The desert wind caught her long dark hair, sending it streaming behind her like smoke, and even in the dim light, I could see she wore a simple white dress that seemed to glow against the darkness. There was something timeless about her appearance, as if she'd stepped out of a photograph from decades past. She was beautiful in that haunting way that makes you think of old movies and lost loves, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to hold depths I couldn't quite fathom. Her skin was pale as moonlight, and when she smiled up at me, her teeth were perfect white pearls in the darkness. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. Something European maybe, or perhaps just the careful pronunciation of someone for whom English wasn't their first language. "I've been waiting such a long time." She paused at the passenger door, her hand resting on the chrome handle. "May I come up?" "Sure thing, miss," I replied, reaching over to unlock the door. "Where you headed?" The suspension barely shifted under her weight, and I found myself wondering if she weighed anything at all. As she settled into the passenger seat, I caught a whiff of something strange. Not quite perfume, not quite the desert sage that grew wild along the highway. It was sweeter than that, cloying almost, like flowers left too long in a closed room. "Name's Marcus," I said, putting the truck back in gear and checking my mirrors before pulling back onto the interstate. "You can call me Mac. Most folks do." "Elizabeth," she replied, arranging her white dress carefully around her legs, though I haven't used that name in quite some time. She turned to look at me then, and in the green glow of the dashboard lights, her face seemed to shift slightly, features rearranging themselves in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them directly. I attributed it to road fatigue, that peculiar exhaustion that comes from staring at white lines and reflectors for hours on end. I'd seen stranger things during long hauls, mirages that danced at the edge of perception, shadows that moved independently of their objects. The road plays tricks on a tired mind, and I'd learned to ignore the impossible things that sometimes flickered at the corners of my vision. "So what brings you out to the middle of nowhere at 3 in the morning?" I asked, settling into the familiar rhythm of highway conversation. Most hitchhikers had stories, and I'd heard them all over the years. Broken relationships, lost jobs, family emergencies, adventures gone wrong. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the endless desert that rolled past us in the darkness. "I'm going home," she said finally. "Or perhaps I should say, I'm going to where home used to be. It's been so long since I've seen it. I wonder if I'll recognize the place." Her reflection in the passenger window seemed to waver, and when I glanced over at her directly, her face appeared different somehow, older perhaps, with lines around her eyes that hadn't been there moments before. The miles rolled beneath us in comfortable silence for a while, the CB crackling occasionally with distant conversations between drivers I'd never meet. Elizabeth sat perfectly still beside me, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing so quiet, I sometimes wondered if she was breathing at all. The desert gradually gave way to rolling hills, and the first hints of dawn began to paint the eastern horizon with pale gold light. It was during this quiet hour before sunrise that I began to notice the changes more clearly. At first it was just glimpses caught in my peripheral vision, her profile shifting in ways that made me do double takes. When I looked directly at her, she appeared normal, beautiful in that ethereal way I'd first noted. But when my attention was on the road, her reflection in the windshield seemed to tell a different story entirely. The face I saw in the glass was older, weathered by time, and marked by an expression of profound sadness. Her eyes, which appeared bright and alert when she looked at me directly, seemed hollow and distant in the reflection, as if they'd seen things no one should have to witness. Her mouth, which curved in gentle smiles when we spoke, appeared to be moving silently in the glass, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow felt in the marrow of my bones. "Marcus," she said suddenly, breaking the pre-dawn quiet, "do you believe in second chances?" The question caught me off guard, and I found myself considering it seriously as the sunrise painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. "I suppose I do," I replied. "Sometimes we all deserve another shot at getting things right." She nodded, and when she turned to look at me, her face seemed to flicker like a television with poor reception, two images superimposed on each other. The beautiful young woman I'd picked up was still there, but beneath her features I caught glimpses of something else entirely. An older face, lined with sorrow, eyes that held the weight of decades. It was as if two different people occupied the same space, their features fighting for dominance. "I made a mistake once," Elizabeth continued, her voice now carrying harmonics that shouldn't have been possible, as if two people were speaking in perfect synchronization. "A terrible mistake that cost me everything, my home, my family, my life as I knew it. I've been trying to fix it ever since, but some mistakes can't be undone, can they? Some mistakes follow you forever." The temperature in the cab seemed to drop suddenly, and my breath began to fog in the morning air. The heater was running, but it felt as if winter had somehow crept into the truck, bringing with it a cold that came from someplace much deeper than mere weather. Elizabeth's image in the windshield was becoming more distinct now, and I could see that the older face was speaking different words than the ones I was hearing, her lips moving in patterns that didn't match the sounds reaching my ear. I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I found myself checking the mirrors more frequently, as if expecting to see something following us along the empty highway. I trusted the wrong person, she said, and now I could hear both voices clearly, the young woman's sweet tones overlaid with the older voice's bitter regret. I believed promises that were never meant to be kept, and when I discovered the truth, when I confronted him about his lies, well, he made sure I could never tell anyone what I'd learned. The reflection in the windshield was changing now, the older face becoming more prominent, and I could see marks around her throat that definitely hadn't been there before. Dark bruises that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, as if the injury was somehow still fresh despite the decades she claimed had passed. The sunrise was painting the landscape in brilliant oranges and reds, but the light seemed unable to penetrate the growing chill inside the cab. I was certain of it because I'd been watching the highway markers, and there should have been nothing but empty desert for the next 30